Every official story has a version underneath it. Sometimes that version is just noise, fear dressed up as pattern, coincidence mistaken for design. Sometimes it is closer to the truth than anyone in power would prefer. The difficult thing, the thing that makes this subject so endlessly compelling and so genuinely dangerous at the same time, is that it is not always easy to tell the difference.
Because conspiracies are real. That is not the beginning of paranoia. It is history. Governments have lied to their people. Institutions have buried evidence. Powerful groups have made decisions in private that shaped public life in ways the public was never meant to understand. This has happened. It is documented. It is not in question. What is in question, always, is where documented reality ends and the mind's hunger for hidden meaning begins. That line is what these 25 chapters are about. Not to confirm, not to debunk, but to sit with each theory long enough to understand why it exists, what need it fills, what truth might be buried inside it, even when the theory itself is wrong, and what it says about us as a species, that we keep looking for the hand behind the curtain, even when the curtain turns out to be all there is. Some of what you hear will be familiar. You will have encountered pieces of it before, in corners of the internet, in conversations that trailed off when someone walked into the room. Some of it will be new. Some of it will be uncomfortable, for reasons you won't immediately be able to name. All of it is worth understanding, because the most dangerous conspiracy of all is the one you believe without ever asking why. Chapter 1. The Mind That Needs a Villain. There is a car accident at an intersection you drive through every day. You saw it this morning. The vehicles at odd angles, the glass on the asphalt, the particular stillness of a scene that has already happened and is now just the aftermath of itself. And almost immediately, without deciding to, you began to assemble a story. Someone ran the light. Someone was on their phone. Someone had been drinking even at that hour, or was going too fast, or had taken their eyes off the road for a moment at exactly the wrong moment. The story came quickly, and it came with a protagonist and a cause and a sequence of events that led from the beginning to the broken glass on the ground. The chaos of the intersection has been organized in your mind into a narrative with an explanation at its center. This is what the mind does. It is what the mind cannot help but do. The drive toward explanation, toward causation, toward the identification of an agent who made something happen, is not a quirk of personality or a failure of rationality. It is a feature of a cognitive system that evolved in a world where understanding causes was often the difference between surviving and not. The rustle in the grass is the wind, or it is a predator. The illness that swept through the settlement was bad water or an enemy's poison. The person who identified the cause correctly and acted on the identification correctly had a better chance of seeing the next morning than the person who could not be bothered to look for the cause at all. The cause-seeking mind is the mind that lasted. We are descended from the cause-seekers, but the cause-seeking tendency does not only operate when the cause is there to be found. It operates continuously, even in the presence of events that have no single cause, or that are the product of so many overlapping causes that identifying any one of them as the explanation is a simplification. And it operates with a specific and consistent bias. It prefers causes that are intentional over causes that are accidental. It prefers agents over processes. It prefers villains over systems. Given a choice between an explanation that involves someone choosing to make something happen and an explanation that involves the blind accumulation of random and uncoordinated events producing an outcome that looks significant, the mind tends to reach for the first explanation before the second one has been fully considered. The psychologists call this the intentionality bias, the automatic attribution of intention to events that have the structural features of intentional action, even when the evidence for actual intention is thin. A toddler who trips over a rock is as likely to express anger at the rock as to note that rocks are inanimate objects without intentions. The anger is the natural response of a mind that is still calibrating the boundary between agents and non-agents, between things that act and things that simply are. But adults retain versions of this bias in contexts where the calibration has not been well tested. The economy that collapsed, the disease that spread, the election that went wrong, all of these look to the intentionality-biased mind like events that someone made happen, because events of this significance, with consequences this widespread and this painful,
feel like they must have been aimed at something rather than simply having occurred. And here is the psychological center of what this series will be exploring: the deliberate plot, the story in which a small group of powerful people decided to make something happen and then made it happen, is, in a specific and important sense, more comforting than the alternative. The alternative is that large and consequential things happen for reasons that are distributed across thousands of actors and millions of small decisions and decades of accumulated conditions, that no one in particular chose the outcome, even though the outcome occurred, that the world in its large movements is not being directed by any will toward any destination. This alternative is accurate, or at least more accurate than the simple villain story, for most of the significant events in human history, and it is deeply, specifically uncomfortable. Because what it means is that the chaos is real, that the forces which shape lives and societies are not controlled by anyone who can be identified and exposed and stopped. That the appropriate emotional response to large-scale misfortune is not the satisfying anger of the person who has found the villain, but the much harder emotional response of the person who has found nothing at the center except the accumulation of impersonal forces that were never aimed at anyone in particular. The anger has an object. The grief of the structureless explanation does not. And the mind that has a choice between the anger with the object and the grief without one will reach for the anger almost every time. This is not stupidity. The people who are most drawn to intentional explanations for complex events are not demonstrably less intelligent than the people who are less drawn to them. The research on this is consistent and slightly humbling. The intentionality bias is a feature of human cognition in general, not a pathology of the credulous. What varies across people is not the presence of the bias, but the degree to which other cognitive tendencies, the tendency to seek disconfirming evidence, the tolerance for complexity and ambiguity, the familiarity with statistical reasoning provide a check on the bias. The checks are themselves products of education and exposure and the specific intellectual habits that certain environments develop and others do not. They are not virtues that some people have and others lack. They are tools that some people have been given and others have not. The conspiracy theory is the intentionality bias running without adequate checks, in a domain where the events are genuinely significant and the official explanations are genuinely unsatisfying, and the possibility of hidden causation is genuinely non-zero. The conspiracy theory is not an irrational response to a rational world. It is a very human response to a world that keeps producing outcomes that the human mind finds difficult to accept as the product of accident and drift and the uncoordinated movement of impersonal forces. The villain makes the world make sense, and the world for most of the history of human consciousness has not made sense in the absence of a villain. Which is not the same as saying the villain is always there, but it does explain why the mind goes looking, even when the intersection is empty, and the glass on the ground is just glass. Chapter 2. The Lie That Was Actually True. There is a meeting that took place in a government building in the early 1960s. The people in the room had titles and security clearances and the specific kind of institutional authority that comes from occupying positions at the center of a superpower during the tensest period of its existence. And they were discussing, in the language of memos and operational planning and careful bureaucratic euphemism, a proposal to stage terrorist attacks on American soil, to shoot down an American airplane, or to sink a boat carrying American citizens, or to arrange incidents that would produce American casualties, and then to blame these events on Cuba, which would provide the justification for an American military invasion of the island. The plan had a name: Operation Northwoods. It was signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military and delivered to the Secretary of Defense. It was rejected. The Kennedy administration did not implement it, but the meeting happened. The documents existed, the signatures were on the papers, and for the decades between the meeting and the declassification, anyone who had claimed that the United States military was capable of planning staged attacks on its own citizens to justify a war would have been dismissed with the particular kind of certainty that is reserved for people who have departed from the territory of the credible. The dismissal would have felt entirely reasonable, because it is entirely reasonable to dismiss claims about extraordinary institutional malfeasance without evidence. The problem is that the evidence eventually arrived. This is the specific difficulty at the center of this series, and it needs to be stated clearly at the beginning of the second chapter, rather than approached obliquely. Some conspiracy theories are true, not most, not even a substantial fraction of the full catalog of conspiratorial belief that has accumulated across the decades of its most prolific production, but some, enough to require that any honest engagement with the phenomenon of conspiracy thinking takes seriously the possibility that institutional power sometimes actually does what the conspiracy theorists claim it does. The dismissal of all conspiratorial claims on the grounds that conspiratorial things do not happen is not a defensible position. It is a position that the historical record has refuted. COINTELPRO is not a theory. It is a documented program of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, running from the mid-1950s through the early 1970s, which engaged in systematic surveillance, infiltration, harassment, and disruption of political organizations the FBI deemed subversive. The targets included the Communist Party and various left-wing organizations. But also, and this is the part that should sit uncomfortably, the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was surveilled, harassed, and the subject of an anonymous letter from the FBI encouraging him to commit suicide. The Black Panther Party was infiltrated and subjected to operations designed to create internal conflict and undermine its leadership. These were not theories, they were programs. They ran for years. They were coordinated and deliberate and specifically designed to remain hidden from the people they targeted and from the public. MKUltra is not a theory. It is a documented program of the Central Intelligence Agency that ran from the early 1950s into the 1970s, in which the agency conducted experiments on human beings, including American and Canadian citizens, using LSD and other drugs and psychological techniques to investigate the possibility of mind control. Some of the subjects did not consent. Some were patients in psychiatric facilities. Some were prisoners. The program was concealed from congressional oversight. When it was finally investigated, many of the records had been destroyed on the orders of the CIA director. What survived was sufficient to confirm the broad outline of what had occurred. The Tuskegee experiment is not a theory. It is a documented program of the United States Public Health Service, running from 1932 to 1972, in which 400 black men in Alabama who had syphilis were enrolled in a study and then deliberately denied treatment, including after penicillin became the established cure in the 1940s, so that researchers could observe the natural progression of the untreated disease. The men were not told they were being denied treatment. They were told they were receiving medical care. The program ran for 40 years. The trust it destroyed in American medical institutions among Black Americans is not irrational. It is the appropriate response of a community that has documented evidence that medical institutions have been willing to use its members as experimental subjects without consent. The tobacco industry's concealment of what its own research had determined about the health effects of smoking is not a theory. The internal documents that were eventually made public through litigation showed that the major tobacco companies had conducted research in the 1950s and 1960s that confirmed the link between smoking and cancer, and that they had subsequently coordinated a public relations strategy designed to cast doubt on this finding, to fund alternative research that would produce ambiguous results, and to maintain the appearance of scientific uncertainty about a question that their own scientists had internally answered. The people who suspected in the 1960s and 1970s that the tobacco industry was lying about what it knew about smoking were not paranoid. They were correct. The pattern that these cases share is worth examining because it is the pattern that makes the question of institutional conspiracy genuinely difficult to reason about. In each case, the activity was real and was concealed. In each case, people who suspected something similar to what was actually occurring were dismissed as paranoid or credulous. In each case, the concealment required coordination across multiple people and over significant periods of time. And in each case, the revelation came not from investigative intuition or theoretical inference, but from documents, from the specific and irreplaceable evidentiary form of the internal record that the institution produced in the course of conducting its activities, and that eventually, through legal processes or whistleblowers, or the passage of time and the declassification that follows it, became available to people outside the institution. The lesson that many people draw from these cases is that institutional conspiracy is common, and that the appropriate response to institutional claims is comprehensive suspicion. This lesson is understandable given the evidence, but it is not quite the right lesson. The right lesson is more specific. It is that institutional power is capable of concealing deliberate wrongdoing, that this concealment can be effective for significant periods of time, and that the appropriate response is the specific kind of scrutiny that these revelations eventually produced. Not comprehensive suspicion, which is not discriminating enough to be useful, but specific, evidence-based, document-seeking scrutiny that holds institutions accountable to what can actually be verified rather than to what can be theorized. The difference between the documented programs and most conspiracy theories is not that the documented programs involve institutional wrongdoing and the theories do not. It is that the documented programs were eventually grounded in evidence that could be examined and disputed and verified. The theory that survives the absence of evidence by incorporating the absence as part of the cover-up is doing something fundamentally different from the investigation that produces the documents. The lie was actually true. This is the thing that makes the whole question hard, because it means the dismissal was wrong, and being wrong about the dismissal does not mean being wrong about the next claim. But it does mean the next claim cannot be dismissed on the grounds that these things simply do not happen. Chapter 3. The Moon and the Doubt It Left Behind. On a July morning in 1969, somewhere between 600 million and 1 billion people watched the same thing at the same time. This had never happened before in human history and would not happen again at that scale for many years. The thing they watched was grainy and the picture quality was poor and the sound had a delay, and the figures moving on the screen were wearing suits that made them look like something from a science fiction film that was trying very hard with a limited budget. And yet the people watching knew they were seeing something that no human eyes had ever seen, and that very few human minds had seriously imagined would be possible within their own lifetimes. A human being was standing on the moon, and then a second human being was standing on the moon, and they were doing things on the moon, walking and talking and picking up rocks, in a way that confirmed with the specific authority of direct observation that the impossible thing had actually occurred. 3 years later, the Apollo program ended. The last human beings to stand on the moon were Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt, who departed the lunar surface in December 1972. And then, for reasons that are partially about budget and partially about the shift in political priorities that followed the end of the space race, and partially about the specific difficulty and expense of doing something that had already been done, no human being went back. The technology that accomplished the landings was not maintained. The institutional knowledge that made the missions possible dispersed. The Saturn V rocket, which remains the most powerful launch vehicle ever flown, was not produced again. The program that put human beings on the moon was discontinued, and the discontinuation has lasted for more than 50 years. Into the space left by the discontinuation, a specific question moved and established itself. If we did it, why did we stop? If the technology existed, why was it abandoned? If the accomplishment was real, why does the evidence for it consist primarily of footage that looks, to modern eyes accustomed to the resolution of contemporary video, like something that could have been staged? These questions are not entirely unreasonable questions. The discontinuation is real. The footage does look dated. The institutional dispersal of the relevant expertise is real. And the specific historical context in which the United States government was simultaneously conducting a war in Southeast Asia on the basis of a fabricated incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, lying to the public about the progress of that war, and running covert programs of domestic surveillance and disruption, provides a backdrop in which the claim that the government would not deceive the public about a significant national accomplishment has a harder time finding purchase than it might otherwise have had. The specific claims of the moon landing hoax theory are worth understanding because they are more detailed than the summary dismissal of them tends to acknowledge. The flag that appeared to wave in a vacuum, the photographs in which the shadows fall at angles that seem inconsistent with a single light source, the radiation of the Van Allen belts, which some have argued would have been lethal to the astronauts passing through them, the quality of the footage, which to eyes trained on contemporary video looks less convincing than what a sufficiently well-funded film production could have achieved. The claim is not simply that the government lied. It is that specific physical and photographic evidence, examined carefully, reveals anomalies that a genuine moon landing would not have produced. The responses to these specific claims are also detailed, and to people who follow them carefully, convincing. The flag wave was produced not by wind, but by the torque of the flagpole being planted in the lunar soil, which set the flag oscillating in a way that continued until the motion dampened, which in the absence of air resistance took longer than it would on Earth. The shadow angles that appear inconsistent with a single light source are the product of the uneven lunar terrain, and the wide-angle lenses that compress apparent distances. And the photographs show exactly what optical physics would predict given those conditions. The Van Allen belts are genuinely a source of radiation exposure, and the NASA engineers who designed the mission trajectory did so specifically to minimize the time the astronauts spent in the most intense parts of the belts. And the total radiation dose the astronauts received was significant but not lethal. The quality of the footage was not the quality of what a well-funded film production in 1969 could have achieved, which was demonstrated by the actual well-funded film productions of that era, none of which produced footage that looks like the Apollo footage, because the specific look of the Apollo footage is the look of a camera operating in vacuum, under conditions that no film production was going to replicate. But the responses, however thorough, face a specific problem that is not about the quality of the responses. The problem is that the responses exist within the same institutional framework as the original claim. NASA says the landing was real. NASA's evidence says the landing was real. The experts who verify NASA's evidence are operating within a scientific community that has institutional relationships with NASA and with the government agencies that fund NASA. For the person who has concluded that the deception was total and coordinated, the responses from within the institutional framework are not evidence against the theory. They are part of the theory. The expert consensus is the cover-up. This is the structure that makes the moon landing theory, and conspiracy theories in general, so difficult to engage with from the outside. The theory has been designed, whether deliberately or through the gradual evolution of its popular forms, to be immune to the specific kind of evidence that would refute it. The absence of evidence for the hoax is incorporated into the theory as evidence of the sophistication of the hoax. The presence of institutional consensus against the theory is incorporated as evidence of the reach of the conspiracy. The theory is not falsifiable in the way that genuine empirical claims are falsifiable, and its immunity to falsification is not experienced by its proponents as a weakness, but as a feature, as evidence of how thoroughly the cover-up was executed. The moon landing conspiracy theory is also in a specific way that its proponents may not have fully considered, a claim that requires the genuine cooperation of an extraordinary number of people across an extraordinary span of time. The Apollo program employed at its peak over 400,000 people across government agencies, private contractors, universities, and international partners. The 12 astronauts who walked on the moon, and the many more who flew Apollo missions without landing, and the people who trained them and designed their equipment and tracked their missions and analyzed their samples, all of these people would need to be either knowingly complicit in the deception or deceive themselves in ways that their subsequent careers and public statements have not revealed. The geological samples brought back from the moon have been analyzed by scientists in multiple countries, including countries that had strong political motivations to expose an American deception if one existed. And the samples are consistent with a lunar origin in ways that no terrestrial geology replicates. None of this is conclusive in the way that a document is conclusive. The document that revealed Operation Northwoods was the meeting itself, preserved in paper, signed with names. The moon landing's reality rests not on a single document, but on the accumulation of physical evidence, and the consistency of testimony, and the specific character of the lunar samples, and the ongoing work of the retroreflectors left on the lunar surface, which are bounced by lasers from observatories around the world to this day, providing a precise measurement of the moon's distance that only exists if something was placed there. The doubt persists anyway, but because the evidence lives inside a framework that the doubt has already decided cannot be trusted. And the history of real conspiracies has given the doubt enough to stand on, to keep standing, long after the footprints were made. Chapter 4: The Architect, Nobody Elected. There is a room somewhere. It is not always the same room in every version of the idea, but it has consistent features across the versions. It is private. It is accessed only by invitation, and the invitation comes to people who have already demonstrated the kind of power and influence that makes them worth including. The people in the room are not the people on the ballot, or the people in the photographs at the press conference, or the people whose names appear in the newspapers as the authors of significant decisions. The people in the room are the people who decided what the people on the ballot would decide, who own the newspapers rather than appearing in them, who were powerful before the election and will be powerful after it, regardless of the outcome, because the outcome was, to a meaningful degree, determined in advance by conversations that took place in this room and rooms like it. This image is one of the oldest and most persistent in the architecture of conspiratorial thinking. It predates the modern conspiracy theory by centuries. The secret council, the hidden hand, the invisible government behind the visible one, the small group of the genuinely powerful who make the real decisions, while the theater of democratic or aristocratic governance provides a stage for the population to watch and believe in. The image is old enough to have been incorporated into the foundational narratives of nations, old enough to have been projected onto groups as varied as the medieval Knights Templar and the 18th century Illuminati, and the 19th century financial dynasties, and the 20th century globalist institutions, and whatever the current version of the idea is in its contemporary circulation. The persistence of this image requires some explanation. Not the psychological explanation, which has been covered in the first chapter, but the historical and institutional explanation. Why does the idea of a small group making hidden decisions keep recurring across such different historical contexts? The answer, at least in part, is that small groups making hidden decisions is something that actually happens. The corporate board that makes decisions affecting hundreds of thousands of employees who were not consulted. The central bank that sets interest rates in ways that affect every person who uses money, through a process that is technically public, but effectively inaccessible to most people's comprehension or meaningful participation. The diplomatic back channel where the actual terms of agreements are worked out before the formal negotiations produce the document that will be presented as the result of the formal negotiations. The donor class whose financial contributions to political campaigns shape the range of positions that candidates will take on questions that the donors care about. These are not theories. They are descriptions of how institutional power frequently operates. The question the conspiracy theory is asking is not an unreasonable question. Who is actually making the decisions that shape the conditions of billions of lives? And are those people accountable to the people whose lives they are shaping? This is one of the central questions of political philosophy, and it has never been fully answered to anyone's complete satisfaction. Democracy is the best attempt so far at an institutional answer, and democracy's answer is partial and imperfect and subject to the specific kind of corruption that wealth and information asymmetry produce. The conspiracy theory is a folk answer to the same question, less rigorous than the political philosophy, but more emotionally accessible and more directly actionable in the sense that it identifies a villain rather than a system. The specific entities that have occupied the role of the architect nobody elected have shifted across time in ways that reveal as much about the fears and prejudices of the period as about any actual coordination among the powerful. The Illuminati, founded in Bavaria in 1776 by a law professor named Adam Weishaupt as a secret society promoting Enlightenment values against the influence of the Church, was dissolved by the Bavarian government within a decade of its founding. It has since been credited with causing the French Revolution, controlling the global financial system, and managing the entertainment industry, among other projects, despite having ceased to exist as an organization in the 1780s. The persistence of the Illuminati as a conspiracist reference point across 2.5 centuries of actual non-existence is one of the more illuminating features of how these narratives function. The organization is not required. The role persists regardless. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the most consequential and most harmful document in the history of conspiracy literature. It was fabricated by the Russian secret police in the early 20th century and presented as the minutes of a meeting of Jewish leaders planning global domination. It was exposed as a forgery within years of its circulation. It has nevertheless been published, distributed, cited, and believed by millions of people across more than a century of its existence. And the conspiracy theory it instantiated provided ideological cover for some of the worst violence in human history. The document is false in every particular. The harm it caused was real in every particular. The history of the protocols is the history of what happens when the role of the architect nobody elected is projected onto a specific identifiable group of people, with the full weight of the human capacity for scapegoating behind the projection. The Bilderberg Group, which actually exists, which does hold annual meetings, which does include an invitation-only list of prominent politicians, financiers, academics, and business leaders from North America and Europe, which does discuss significant questions of global policy and economics in sessions that are not open to the public and whose proceedings are not officially released, occupies an interesting position in this landscape. It is real. It is genuinely unaccountable to any democratic constituency. The people who attend it do wield significant influence over the conditions of many lives, and the conclusions drawn from these facts in conspiratorial discourse are significantly more dramatic and more specific than the facts themselves support. The Bilderberg Group is not planning a world government. It is a networking event for the globally powerful, which is either reassuring or alarming depending on your prior assessment of whether the globally powerful should be networking privately, but which is not, by the evidence available, a coordinating mechanism for the secret management of human civilization. The World Economic Forum, which hosts the annual Davos meeting, occupies a similar position. Real, genuinely exclusive, genuinely influential, genuinely unaccountable in the democratic sense, and genuinely not, by the evidence available, the coordinating structure of a secret global government, despite being regularly described as such by people who have found in it a contemporary version of the room that is always somewhere and always private, and always populated by the people who are really in charge. The difficulty with the architect nobody elected theory, in all its versions, is the same difficulty that applies to most large-scale conspiracy theories. The coordination it requires is enormous. The secrecy it requires over the relevant timescales is historically unprecedented. The genuine powerful people who attend genuine private meetings have demonstrated, repeatedly, and across the full range of documented cases, that they do not maintain secrecy well when the stakes are high and the participants are numerous. Richard Nixon's inner circle could not maintain the secrecy of the Watergate break-in for 2 years. The tobacco industry's internal research was not maintained as a secret forever. The coordination required to genuinely manage the major political and economic events of the modern world, across national boundaries and competing institutional interests, and the full human range of ambition and ego, and the desire to be seen as important, would be a feat of organizational achievement that no documented human organization has ever approached. And yet the powerful do coordinate. They do share interests. They do make decisions that affect people who were not consulted. The conspiracy theory points at something real from an angle that distorts the real thing into something that explains more than the real thing explains, and is therefore less accurate than the real thing, while being more emotionally satisfying than the real thing. The room exists. It is just less organized than the theory requires, and more boring, and the people in it disagree with each other, more than anyone who needs a villain can afford to believe. Chapter 5: The Disease and the Question of Who Benefited. There is a moment in the arc of every significant epidemic when the question shifts. At first, the question is biological and immediate. What is this? How does it spread? Who is getting sick? And how sick are they getting? And what can be done about that? These are the questions of the acute phase, the phase when the thing is new and the uncertainty about its nature is total, and the focus of everyone involved is the disease itself. And then, as the acute phase extends and the uncertainty begins to resolve and the specific shape of the epidemic becomes clearer, a second set of questions begins to emerge alongside the first, not instead of the first, alongside. Who knew about this before the public was told? Who stood to benefit from the response to it? Who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to produce or release or amplify something that has caused this much disruption and generated this much institutional response? The timing of the shift is not random. It tends to occur at the moment when the disruption becomes large enough that the ordinary explanatory frameworks feel inadequate. A disease that kills a few thousand people in a distant country is a tragedy with a biological explanation. A disease that kills hundreds of thousands, that closes borders and shutters economies and reorganizes the daily life of billions of people, that generates massive government expenditure and emergency regulatory changes and the rapid development of new medical interventions, is a disruption whose scale seems to demand an explanation commensurate with its consequences. And the explanation that the biology offers, that a pathogen emerged in a population that had no immunity to it, and then spread in the ways that respiratory pathogens spread, is accurate but does not feel commensurate. It does not feel large enough for what happened. The accident that produces civilizational disruption has, for the intentionality-seeking mind, the wrong shape. AIDS emerged in the early 1980s, and by the middle of the decade had generated a parallel narrative alongside the biological one. The theory that the virus had been created in an American laboratory and deliberately introduced into populations that the government wanted to reduce, specifically gay men and black communities, was circulating with significant reach by the late 1980s. The Tuskegee experiment was 40 years fresh in the memory of the Black American community. The Reagan administration's documented slowness and apparent indifference in the early years of the epidemic was real and produced real deaths that a different institutional response might have prevented. The communities being devastated were communities that had documented reasons to distrust the institutions responsible for public health. The conspiratorial explanation of AIDS as a deliberate attack was not adopted by credulous or irrational people. It was adopted by people whose relationship with the relevant institutions had been shaped by documented betrayal. The biological origin of HIV is well established in the scientific literature. The virus crossed from chimpanzees to human beings in Central Africa, probably in the early 20th century, through the hunting and consumption of bushmeat. The subsequent spread through human populations was the product of urbanization and the specific transmission dynamics of the virus, not of any deliberate introduction. The documented scientific investigation of HIV's origin is extensive, peer-reviewed, and has been conducted by researchers from multiple countries without coordinated findings of a laboratory origin. The conspiracy theory is false on the specific factual question of origin, while pointing at real institutional failures that were separate from the origin but were real. The question of who benefits is a legitimate investigative question when applied to institutional responses to disease. The pharmaceutical industry does benefit financially from epidemic response in ways that are not incidental. The emergency use authorization of novel therapeutics, the rapid regulatory approval of vaccines at scale, the government contracts for medical countermeasures, the expansion of public health infrastructure, all of these produce financial flows that go somewhere. The companies that receive these financial flows have lobbied for the regulatory frameworks that make them possible. The researchers who develop the therapeutics have financial relationships with the companies that manufacture them. The public health officials who make the recommendations that drive the demand have, in some cases, relationships with the institutions that benefit from those recommendations. These connections are real. They are documented. They are the appropriate subjects of scrutiny and transparency requirements, and conflict of interest disclosure rules. The move from these real connections to the conclusion that the disease itself was engineered or released to produce the financial flows is the move that the evidence does not support. The financial benefit from epidemic response is real. The deliberate causation of the epidemic to produce the financial benefit would require a level of coordination, callousness, and technical capability that the same institutions, demonstrating their ordinary inability to coordinate effectively, would somehow have achieved for this specific project. The tobacco industry, which had a clear financial motive to conceal the harms of its product, managed to maintain the concealment for decades before the documents emerged. The concealment of the origin of a disease affecting billions of people, involving thousands of researchers and public health officials across dozens of countries with competing national interests, would be a concealment of a different order entirely. The laboratory leak hypothesis, which became a subject of serious public discussion in the years following the emergence of COVID-19, occupies a different position in this landscape than the deliberate release theories. The question of whether a pathogen can escape from a laboratory engaged in research on that pathogen is not a conspiracy theory. It is a legitimate biosafety question that laboratory accidents in other contexts have answered with a clear yes. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting research on coronaviruses in a city where the outbreak began. The initial investigations into the origin of the outbreak were conducted with a degree of access limitation that did not permit the thoroughness required for a definitive conclusion. The institutional and political dynamics surrounding the origin question in the early period of the pandemic were such that certain hypotheses received more institutional resistance than their evidentiary status alone would have warranted. The possibility of a laboratory origin, whether through accident or deliberate release, is not equally supported by the available evidence, but it is not equivalent to the assertion that Elvis is managing a pharmaceutical company from an underground facility. It is a question about a real event with real institutional actors whose behavior in the relevant period was not transparent. The investigation of that question by people who approach it with genuine evidential standards is different in kind from the unfalsifiable version of the theory that will incorporate any counter-evidence as further proof of the cover-up. Every significant epidemic leaves behind two parallel histories: the biological history, which is what happened in the cells and the populations and the epidemiological curves, and the political history,
which is what happened in the institutions and the governments and the relationships between public health and private interest during and after the outbreak. The biological history has been well documented. The political history is always more complicated and always involves conflicts of interest and institutional failures, and the specific ways in which the financial and political dimensions of epidemic response create incentives that do not always align with the biological facts. The question of who benefited is a real question. It just does not always have the answer that the asking implies. Chapter 6. The photograph that started everything. There is a photograph. It is not a good photograph in the technical sense. The focus is slightly off in the way that photographs taken in haste or in poor light or with inadequate equipment are slightly off, which is most of the photographs that have ever been taken by people in the middle of something, rather than people prepared to take a photograph. The subject is present, but not fully resolved. The edges blur where they should be sharp. The light falls in ways that create shadows where the detail should be and highlights where the shadows should be. And the overall effect is of something that was there, that was captured, but that has not been captured with enough resolution to be unambiguous. And because it is not unambiguous, it is available. It is available to be interpreted. It is available to be seen as the thing that the interpreter needed to see. Photographs have a specific relationship to belief that differs from the relationship of most other kinds of evidence. They present themselves as the thing itself, rather than as a representation of the thing. The photograph says, with the authority of light hitting a surface and leaving a record, "I was there. The world looked like this." Whatever you are seeing in this image is what was present in that place at that moment. The authority is real, and it is also, as the full history of photography demonstrates with considerable thoroughness, frequently misleading. The photograph is always a selection, a fraction of a second, a specific angle, a specific exposure, a specific interpretation of light by a specific recording medium in a specific condition. The world looked like this from here at this moment. It did not necessarily look like this from elsewhere, or at another moment or under different conditions. The Zapruder film, which is not technically a photograph, but functions in the relevant sense as one, is the most consequential piece of accidental visual documentation in American history. Abraham Zapruder was a dressmaker standing on a concrete pedestal in Dealey Plaza in Dallas on November 22, 1963, holding a home movie camera when the motorcade passed and the shots were fired. The film he made is 26 seconds of footage that has been analyzed more thoroughly than any comparable document in the history of film. Frame 313, in which the impact of the fatal shot is visible, has been examined by researchers, analysts, conspiracy theorists, government commissions, forensic experts, and ordinary people for more than 60 years. The film is both the most complete visual record of the event and the source of more interpretive disagreement than almost any other piece of evidence in any other historical event. The disagreement is not primarily about what is visible. It is about what the visible means. The direction of the motion of the head in frame 313, the timing of the shots relative to the positions of the vehicles and the windows, the presence or absence of figures and locations that would or would not be consistent with the official account. These are questions about interpretation, and the interpretations have proliferated across 6 decades in ways that have not converged toward a consensus, despite the full weight of photographic science and forensic analysis being brought to bear on them. The film is clear enough to be definitive evidence of something. It is not clear enough to be definitive evidence of exactly what. The blurry photograph of a large shape in Loch Ness, taken by a physician named Robert Kenneth Wilson in 1934, was reproduced in newspapers around the world and became the foundation of one of the most durable folklore traditions of the 20th century. The photograph showed, or appeared to show, a long neck and small head rising from dark water. It was exactly the kind of image that the imagination required to make the Loch Ness monster credible. Not definitive, not a high-resolution image of the animal in full display, but suggestive enough, in the specific way that blurry photographs of large things in dark water are suggestive, to anchor a belief that had existed before the photograph and that would persist long after. The photograph was eventually revealed, decades later, to have been a staged image involving a toy submarine fitted with a sculpted head. The legend it had anchored continued regardless. The Socorro incident of 1964 produced a set of photographs of landing traces on the ground, and the witness testimony of a police officer named Lonnie Zamora, who described an egg-shaped craft and 2 small figures in white coveralls. The landing traces were physical evidence that could be examined, and they were examined by investigators from multiple agencies who could not explain them by reference to any known aircraft or conventional explanation. The photographs of the traces, combined with Zamora's consistent and apparently sincere account, produced an incident that remains, in the literature of UFO investigation, one of the cases with the strongest physical evidence and the least satisfying conventional explanation. The photographs are not dramatic. They are photographs of ground with depressions in it. They are compelling not for what they show, but for what the showing implies. The specific power of the ambiguous photograph in the generation of belief is related to a feature of visual processing that the psychologists call pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns, especially faces and recognizable shapes, in ambiguous visual stimuli. The clouds that look like animals, the face in the wood grain, the figure in the shadows. This tendency is not a malfunction. It is the visual system doing exactly what it evolved to do, which is to find meaningful patterns in noisy data as quickly as possible, because the failure to detect a meaningful pattern in time is more costly in the ancestral environment than the false positive of detecting a pattern that is not there. The visual system is calibrated towards sensitivity rather than specificity. It will see the pattern even when the pattern is not there, because seeing the pattern when it is not there is survivable in a way that missing the pattern when it is there is not. The photograph that has launched a belief system is almost always an ambiguous photograph. The sharp, high-resolution, fully illuminated image of an extraordinary subject tends not to generate conspiracy theories because it tends not to exist. What exists are photographs taken in haste, in poor light, at distance with inadequate equipment, of subjects that were not posing and not expected, and that the photographer was not prepared to document. These photographs are then circulated among people who are already inclined to see what the photographs appear to show, and the circulation reinforces the belief that the visual evidence provides, and the belief makes subsequent ambiguous images more legible as confirmation, and the system builds. The internet has changed the production and circulation of these photographs in ways that have accelerated the process while also complicating it. Images are now produced in vastly greater quantities and circulated to vastly larger audiences with vastly less friction than at any previous point in the history of photography. The tools for manipulating images are more powerful and more accessible than they have ever been. The tools for detecting manipulation are also more powerful but are less widely distributed and require more expertise to apply. The average person encountering a photograph that claims to show something extraordinary now faces a situation in which the photograph is more likely to have been manipulated than it was in 1934, and less likely to be examined with the tools that would reveal the manipulation. The photograph does not prove the thing it shows. The thing it shows does not determine what it means. What it means is always, at least partly, a function of what the viewer needed to see when they pressed their eye to the viewfinder, of their own interpretation. Chapter 7. The Man Who Knew Too Much. There is a list. It circulates in various forms across the internet and in the literature of conspiracist research, and it concerns people who died in circumstances that someone found suspicious. The list has a theme. The people on it had, or were said to have had, access to information that powerful interests would prefer remain undisclosed. They were witnesses to events whose official account was contested. They were scientists working in sensitive areas. They were journalists investigating powerful institutions. They were insiders who had indicated before their deaths that they intended to speak or were already speaking about things that the institutions they worked within had reason to want kept quiet. And then they died. Not always violently, sometimes from illnesses that could have been natural, sometimes in accidents that could have been accidental, sometimes in suicides that could have been genuine, but always at a moment that the list maker found convenient for the interests that were served by their silence. The persuasive power of these lists rests on a cognitive tendency that is important to understand clearly before anything else. The human mind is poorly calibrated for evaluating the significance of coincidences, particularly coincidences that involve death. Death is not rare. In a world of 8 billion people, a very large number of people die every day from every possible combination of causes. Among the set of people who have access to sensitive information, work in dangerous fields, investigate powerful institutions, or are otherwise adjacent to significant events, deaths will occur at the same rate at which deaths occur in the general population, adjusted for whatever occupational and lifestyle factors apply. The question is not whether people with sensitive knowledge die. They do.
because everyone does. The question is whether they die at a higher rate than would be expected by chance, and the answer to that question requires statistical analysis rather than list making. The lists do not provide statistical analysis. They provide selection. From the full population of people who were adjacent to significant events and survived, and who were adjacent to significant events and died, the lists select the deaths and present them as a pattern. The pattern is real in the sense that the deaths occurred. The pattern is not real in the sense of demonstrating a rate of death that exceeds what would be expected. The selection is the argument, and the argument is presented as though the selection were evidence of causation, when it is evidence only that the list maker found certain deaths noteworthy. With that as the foundation, the specific cases that recur in these discussions deserve honest examination. Not because the lists are right, but because some of the individual cases contain enough genuine ambiguity that dismissing them entirely is also not honest. The death of Frank Olson in 1953 is one of the genuinely strange cases in American government history. Olson was a biological warfare scientist working for the CIA who was covertly dosed with LSD by his colleagues as part of the MK-Ultra program without his knowledge or consent. He became deeply disturbed in the days following the dosing and was taken to New York for psychiatric care. He fell from the window of a 10th-floor hotel room and died from the fall. The official account was suicide. His family maintained for decades that the death was suspicious. In 1994, his body was exhumed and forensic examination revealed a hematoma on his skull that was inconsistent with a fall and consistent with a blow to the head before the fall. The case was referred to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. No charges were ever filed. The actual cause of Olson's death remains, in any honest accounting, uncertain. The context of his death, a man with knowledge of covert government programs in a disturbed state following an involuntary drug experiment, is not a context that makes the official account of simple suicide feel fully adequate. The death of Karen Silkwood in 1974 is similarly ambiguous. Silkwood was a nuclear plant worker and labor activist who had been gathering documentation of safety violations at the Kerr-McGee plutonium plant in Oklahoma, and was on her way to meet a New York Times journalist and a union official when her car left the road and she was killed. The documents she was said to be carrying were not found at the scene. The official account was a single car accident caused by the driver falling asleep. An independent forensic examination of the vehicle suggested that the car had been struck from behind before leaving the road. The investigation was inconclusive. The documents were never recovered. The case became a reference point for discussions of corporate and government responses to whistleblowers, and the ambiguities in it are genuine ambiguities that the available evidence did not resolve. These cases are genuine in their ambiguity. They are not the same as the majority of the deaths that appear on the lists, which include people who died of cancer, people who died in air crashes with no connection to any significant event, people who died of heart attacks at ages when heart attacks are common, and people whose connection to the relevant events is tenuous enough that their inclusion in the list requires a broad definition of what it means to know too much. The genuine ambiguity of the Olson case and the Silkwood case does not extend to the whole list, but the whole list uses the genuine ambiguity of a few cases to suggest that the pattern it presents is real. The specific pattern that conspiracy theory finds compelling here, the knowledgeable insider silenced before speaking, is a pattern that does sometimes occur in reality. Whistleblowers have been harassed, prosecuted, had their careers destroyed, and in documented cases in other countries, been killed. Journalists investigating powerful interests have been murdered in countries where the rule of law is weak, and the powerful operate with impunity. The category of the person who knew too much and paid for knowing is not an empty category. What the lists do is project this pattern onto all ambiguous deaths in the vicinity of significant events, without the statistical or forensic analysis that would be required to distinguish genuine cases from the coincidences that death in a complex world inevitably produces. The man who knew too much is a real figure. He has appeared in documented history enough times that his appearance cannot be dismissed as purely imaginary. What the conspiracy theory does with him is extend his reality into territories where the evidence for his presence is the list rather than the investigation, the selection rather than the statistics, the pattern that was found because it was looked for rather than because it was demonstrated. The coincidence of proximity is not the same as evidence of causation, but the coincidence is real, and the cases where it was not a coincidence are real enough that the pattern keeps looking like a pattern, long after the investigation has moved on.
Chapter 8: The water, the air, the things you cannot see.
There is something in the water. This sentence has been true for most of human history in a way that was not metaphorical and not paranoid, but simply accurate. The water that people drank was frequently contaminated with things that made them sick, and the sickness was not always traceable to its source because the source was invisible, and the connection between the water and the illness required a kind of epidemiological reasoning that most people did not have access to, and that the institutions responsible for public health did not always pursue. The germ theory of disease was not established until the 19th century. Before that, the things in the water were making people sick in ways that were experienced as mysterious, as divine judgment or bad air or simple misfortune, rather than as the predictable consequence of drinking water that contained the bacteria of human waste. The history of what has actually been in the water, the documented history, is not a history that supports simple reassurance about the safety of public water supplies. Lead was used in pipes and in paint and in gasoline for decades after evidence of its harm was available, because the economic interests that benefited from its use were capable of generating enough regulatory delay that the transition away from it took far longer than the evidence alone would have required. Flint, Michigan is not a historical example. It is a recent one. The residents of Flint were drinking water contaminated with lead from pipes that the government responsible for their water supply had not maintained. And when they raised concerns about the quality of the water, those concerns were initially dismissed by the institutions that were responsible for the problem. The concerns were not unfounded. The institutions were not responding appropriately. The people who suspected that something was wrong with their water were correct. Fluoride is the most discussed additive in the history of water conspiracy theory, and it is worth examining in some detail, because it exists at the intersection of a genuinely complex public health intervention and a long history of conspiratorial interpretation. Fluoride is added to public water supplies in many countries at low concentrations on the basis of evidence that it reduces tooth decay, particularly in children. The evidence for this effect is genuine and substantial. The intervention is not covert. It is publicly disclosed, publicly debated, and in many jurisdictions has been the subject of democratic deliberation, including referendums and legislative decisions. The fluoride in the water is not a secret. The conspiracy theory about fluoride involves a range of claims of varying quality. The claim that fluoride, at the concentrations used in water fluoridation, produces cognitive harm, specifically reduced IQ in children, has a more complex evidentiary status than either its proponents or its dismissers tend to acknowledge. There is a body of research, primarily from studies conducted in China, on populations exposed to fluoride at concentrations significantly higher than those used in Western water fluoridation, that suggests an association between high fluoride exposure and lower cognitive performance. There is also a body of research from Western countries at fluoridation concentrations that does not find this association. The National Toxicology Program in the United States conducted a systematic review completed in 2024 that concluded the evidence was suggestive of an association between fluoride exposure and lower IQ in children, even at some of the concentrations used in water systems, while acknowledging significant uncertainty in the evidence. This is not the same as saying that water fluoridation at current levels is causing cognitive harm. It is saying that the question is more genuinely uncertain than either the dismissive position or the conspiratorial position acknowledges. The chemtrails theory holds that the white trails left by aircraft at altitude, which are condensation trails formed by the interaction of hot engine exhaust with cold air at high altitude, are in fact the deliberate spraying of chemical or biological agents into the atmosphere for purposes that various versions of the theory specify as population control, weather modification, or some form of broad-spectrum harm to the population. The condensation trail explanation for the trails is fully adequate to explain their appearance, their duration under different atmospheric conditions, and their variation with aircraft type and altitude and temperature. The theory requires that every aircraft operated by every airline in every country be either knowingly or unknowingly participating in a spraying program, and that the thousands of pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, meteorologists, and atmospheric scientists who interact with these aircraft daily have either not noticed or are collectively silent about what they know. The research on atmospheric chemistry does document real concern about the effects of aviation on the climate, particularly through the formation of contrails and their contribution to cirrus cloud cover, which affects how much solar radiation reaches and leaves the Earth. There are serious proposals within the field of geoengineering research for deliberate stratospheric aerosol injection as a potential response to climate change. These proposals are openly discussed in scientific literature and involve real questions about governance and risk. They are not chemtrails in the conspiratorial sense, but they are proposals to deliberately put things in the atmosphere for climate-related purposes, and the existence of serious research in this area provides a factual basis from which the conspiracy theory can be built, even if the theory builds well past what the facts support. The 5G theory, which became prominent during the COVID-19 pandemic, holds that fifth-generation wireless communication technology either causes illness directly or was deployed in coordination with the pandemic response for surveillance or control purposes. The electromagnetic spectrum used by 5G networks is non-ionizing, meaning it does not have the energy required to break chemical bonds or damage DNA in the way that ionizing radiation such as X-rays and gamma rays does. The biological mechanism by which non-ionizing radiation at the power levels used in telecommunications could produce the proposed effects has not been established. The specific claim that 5G towers were being deployed to spread COVID-19, a disease caused by a virus that is not affected by electromagnetic radiation, required a causal mechanism that was not specified. What all of these theories share is the combination of a genuine underlying concern, with an explanation that exceeds what the evidence supports. The concern about what is in the water is legitimate. The concern about what is in the air is legitimate. The concern about the long-term biological effects of environmental exposures to novel technologies and chemicals is legitimate. These concerns are not irrational, and the history of documented harms from industrial and governmental decisions about environmental exposure is long enough that they cannot be dismissed on the grounds that institutions responsible for public health always act in the public interest. What the theories do with these legitimate concerns is provide a specific and intentional explanation for fears that are real, but whose actual sources are diffuse and institutional and structural, rather than the product of a deliberate decision by identifiable people to poison a population. The leap from the legitimate concern to the specific theory of deliberate harm is the leap that the evidence does not support. But the legitimate concern, carried without an explanation that satisfies the intentionality-seeking mind, finds the deliberate explanation more bearable than the structural one. The corporation that cut costs in ways that led to lead in the pipes is a more comforting explanation than the system that produced a corporation whose cost-cutting was permitted by regulatory frameworks that were shaped by lobbying from the industry being regulated. Both explanations are true. The second is more accurate and more structurally useful. The first is more emotionally satisfying. The things you cannot see are there. Some of them are harmful. The question of who put them there and whether the putting was deliberate is the question that the history of some real harms has made impossible to simply wave away. Chapter 9. The War That May Have Been Arranged. There is a moment before every significant war that has a quality different from the moments before other kinds of large events. A crisis, a confrontation, an incident that functions as the trigger. The incident is always specific. A ship sinking, an assassination, an attack on a military installation, a provocation at a border. The incident produces outrage, and the outrage produces the political conditions for military action that the outrage alone could not have produced from a standing start. People who were not willing to go to war before the incident become willing to go to war because of it. The incident is the mechanism that converts a political possibility into a political reality, that transforms the war that was being contemplated into the war that is being fought. And sometimes, not always and not in most cases, but sometimes, in ways that are documented rather than theorized, the incident was not what it appeared to be. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is the most clearly documented example in American military history. In August 1964, the Johnson administration reported to Congress and the public that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin on two separate occasions, the second of which occurred on August 4th. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, passed by Congress with 2 dissenting votes in the Senate and none in the House, authorized the president to take military action in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The resolution was the legal foundation for the entire escalation of American involvement in Vietnam that followed. The first incident, on August 2nd, was real. North Vietnamese torpedo boats did engage the USS Maddox in disputed waters. The second incident, on August 4th, is now established by the documentary record to have been either a misidentification of radar returns in rough weather or a fabrication. The signals intelligence that was used to support the case for the second attack was later shown to have been misread or selectively presented.
Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, decades later, acknowledged that the second attack almost certainly did not occur.
The Johnson administration had, in the hours immediately following the reported attack, received signals from the commander of the Maddocks expressing significant doubt about whether an attack had occurred, and this doubt was not communicated to Congress or the public. The war that killed 58,000 Americans and several million Vietnamese escalated on the basis of an incident that the administration had reason to doubt and did not adequately investigate. The Spanish-American War of 1898 began with the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which killed 266 American sailors. The Hearst and Pulitzer newspapers, engaged in the circulation competition that would later be called yellow journalism, provided the phrase that defined the moment: "Remember the Maine." The Spanish government was blamed for the sinking on the basis of evidence that was asserted rather than demonstrated. The war that followed removed Spain from Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, and established the United States as a Pacific and Caribbean power. The cause of the Maine's explosion was investigated multiple times across the subsequent century, with different conclusions at different times, and the most technically sophisticated investigation, conducted in the 1970s, concluded that the most likely cause was an internal accident in the coal bunker adjacent to the forward ammunition magazine, rather than an external attack. The war that was partly justified by the sinking was fought over an incident whose cause remains genuinely uncertain, and for which the blame placed on Spain was not supported by the evidence available at the time. The Gleiwitz incident of 1939 is the most explicit and least ambiguous example of an engineered trigger in modern history, because the engineering was later documented by the people who did it. On August 31, 1939, SS troops wearing Polish uniforms staged an attack on a German radio station at Gleiwitz, left the body of a concentration camp prisoner dressed in a Polish uniform as evidence, and broadcast a brief anti-German message in Polish. Hitler cited the attack the following day as justification for the invasion of Poland that began the Second World War. The incident was a fabrication organized by the SS and acknowledged as such in the Nuremberg trials. The war that followed the fabrication killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. These examples exist at different points on a spectrum of deliberateness. The Gleiwitz incident was entirely fabricated, a false flag operation planned in advance with the specific purpose of manufacturing a justification for a war that had already been decided upon. The Gulf of Tonkin second incident was at minimum a failure of honest reporting to the people who needed accurate information to make decisions of enormous consequence, and at maximum, a deliberate misrepresentation of what the intelligence showed. The Maine sinking may have been a genuine accident that was exploited for political purposes rather than engineered as a trigger. The spectrum runs from pure fabrication through selective presentation through exploitation of genuine events, and the different points on the spectrum are morally and historically distinct in ways that matter. What the existence of these cases establishes is that the question of whether a triggering incident was genuine should be asked rather than assumed. The question is not paranoid. It is the question that responsible historical investigation asks, and that several significant investigations have answered in ways that complicated the original official account. The Gleiwitz incident, the Gulf of Tonkin evidence, the subsequent investigation into the Maine, these are not the products of conspiracy theorists. They are the products of historians and journalists and government investigations that took the question seriously and found answers that the original account did not provide. The conspiracy theory version of this history extends the documented pattern into territories where the documentation does not follow. If the Gulf of Tonkin's second incident was fabricated, then perhaps all triggering incidents are fabricated. If the Gleiwitz attack was a false flag, then perhaps all wars begin with false flags. The documented cases become the template for an interpretation of history in which every war is arranged, every trigger is engineered, every conflict serves the interests of a class of people who benefit from wars without fighting in them. The documented cases are true. The generalized theory extrapolated from them exceeds what the documentation supports. But the generalized theory is not entirely without foundation in the structure it proposes. Wars do serve the interests of armament manufacturers and resource extractors and empire builders in ways that the people who die in them generally do not share. The institutions that decide to go to war are not identical to the institutions that bear the cost of the war. The asymmetry of who decides and who pays is a real feature of how military conflict has been organized throughout most of recorded history. The conspiracy theory identifies this asymmetry correctly. What it adds to the correct identification is the specific mechanism of deliberate engineering that the evidence supports in some cases and not in others. The triggering incident was real, or it was exploited, or it was arranged. The historical record says all three of these have happened, and the difficulty is that from inside the incident, when the outrage is fresh and the question is not yet being asked. Chapter 10. The Bloodline That Never Ends. There is a quality that certain families have that is different from wealth in the ordinary sense. Wealth in the ordinary sense is accumulated and then dispersed, diluted across generations, lost to mismanagement or misfortune, or the simple arithmetic of inheritance divided among children who divide it again among their own children, until the original concentration has become a diffusion that no longer resembles what it started as. Most wealth works this way. Most family fortunes follow this trajectory. The stories of the great industrial fortunes of the 19th century include, almost without exception, the eventual story of the dissipation. The founders accumulated. The inheritors spent. The grandchildren received enough to be comfortable. The great-grandchildren received less. The fifth generation received a name that no longer came with a fortune to match it. And then there are the other families, the ones whose wealth has not dispersed in this way, whose names appear in the documentation of significant financial and political events across spans of time that make the ordinary trajectory of family fortune look brief. The Rothschilds, who have been documented as significant players in European finance since the late 18th century, and who remain, in various branches, significant financial actors in the present. The Rockefellers, whose initial fortune from Standard Oil was dispersed into a structure of foundations and political influence that has maintained the family's significance across more than a century since the original accumulation. The Habsburgs, who controlled significant portions of Europe for nearly 6 centuries through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriage, and the specific ability of a dynasty to treat political power as a heritable asset rather than an earned one. These families are real. Their longevity is real. The mechanisms by which they maintained their power and influence across generations are documented, and in many cases are the subject of serious historical scholarship rather than only conspiratorial speculation. The Rothschild family's influence on European finance in the 19th century is not a theory. It is the subject of multiple academic histories. The Rockefeller family's use of philanthropy and institutional investment to maintain influence after the dissolution of Standard Oil is not a theory. It is a documented feature of how American elite power has operated. The Habsburg dynasty's use of marriage and inheritance to build and maintain an empire is the subject of one of the richest historiographical traditions in European scholarship. The conspiracy theory that builds from these real foundations takes the documented mechanisms of dynastic power maintenance and extends them in several directions simultaneously. It extends them in time, suggesting that the relevant dynasties trace their origins not to the early modern period, but to ancient history, sometimes to specific bloodlines that are claimed to connect contemporary elite families to figures from antiquity or from religious history. It extends them in scope, suggesting that the coordination among these families is more complete and more deliberate than the documented evidence of cooperation among elites would suggest, moving from the documented reality of elite networks to the claim of a unified management structure. And it extends them in purpose, suggesting that the maintenance of dynastic power is not the ordinary self-interested behavior of people with power who want to keep it, which is well documented across all of human history, but the implementation of a specific agenda that has been continuous across the relevant centuries. The specific claim about bloodlines, that contemporary elite families share a genetic heritage that is distinct from that of ordinary people, and that this heritage is deliberately maintained through controlled breeding, is the version of the theory that most explicitly departs from the documented into the unfounded. Human genetics does not support the existence of a distinct elite genetic lineage. The intermarriage that characterized European aristocracy for centuries produced the well-documented genetic consequences of restricted breeding populations, including elevated rates of hereditary conditions, rather than the superior capabilities that the bloodline theory posits. The documented history of elite intermarriage is a history of political strategy, rather than genetic preservation, and the strategy was aimed at consolidating territory and legitimacy rather than maintaining a bloodline in the genetic sense.
What the bloodline theory is responding to, however, is a real feature of elite reproduction that has a genuine and documented existence. The families that have maintained power across multiple generations have done so not primarily through genetic inheritance, but through what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called the transmission of capital in its various forms. Financial capital, obviously, is transmitted through inheritance, but cultural capital, the specific knowledge and habits and ways of understanding the world that allow people to navigate elite institutions successfully, is also transmitted. Social capital, the networks of relationship and trust that provide access to information and opportunity, is also transmitted. Educational capital, access to the specific institutions that credential people for elite positions, is transmitted through the financial resources that make such access possible. The transmission of these forms of capital produces a real phenomenon that is distinct from, but related to what the bloodline theory describes. Children born into families with significant accumulated capital of these various kinds have access to opportunities and develop capacities that children born without such capital do not have. The reproduction of elite status across generations is real and documented, and produces patterns of outcome that look from the outside like something being managed. The management, however, is mostly the ordinary self-interested behavior of people who have things they want their children to have, operating through mechanisms that are not secret, but are embedded in the institutional structures of education and finance and social connection that constitute the infrastructure of elite reproduction. The gap between this documented reality and the bloodline theory is the gap between a system that produces outcomes that look like management without requiring coordination, and a theory that requires coordination in order to explain the outcomes. The documented reality is less emotionally satisfying than the theory because it does not have a villain in the necessary sense. The parents who send their children to elite schools and use their connections to open doors and instruct their children in the codes and customs of elite life are not villains. They are doing what parents with resources do, which is to deploy those resources in ways that benefit their children. The system that produces and reproduces this behavior is the thing that requires critique and reform, but the system does not have a face, and does not have a meeting room, and does not have a document that anyone can sign to end it. The bloodline that never ends is real as a sociological phenomenon and false as a genetic one. Real families have maintained real power across real generations through documented mechanisms that include, but are not limited to, financial inheritance. The conspiracy theory takes these documented mechanisms and adds to them a coordination and intention that the documentation does not support, producing a more satisfying explanation at the cost of a more accurate one. The family names persist, the wealth concentrates, the access passes from parent to child, and the question of whether this is the product of a managed conspiracy or the emergent property of a system that nobody designed but everybody maintains is the question that the documented evidence does not answer the way the theory needs it to. Chapter 11. The Weather That Listens. There is a moment in the history of weather modification that is not hypothetical, and not theoretical, and not the product of anyone's imagination working overtime in the direction of paranoia. It is documented in military records and in the congressional hearings that eventually brought it to light. During the Vietnam War, the United States military conducted a classified operation called Operation Popeye, which ran from 1967 to 1972 and involved seeding clouds over the Ho Chi Minh Trail with silver iodide, with the goal of extending the monsoon season, increasing rainfall, and thereby making the trails impassable for longer periods of time. The operation was real. The technology worked to some measurable degree. The military was deliberately modifying the weather over another country during a time of war, for strategic purposes, without the knowledge of the American public or Congress. When the existence of Operation Popeye was revealed by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh in 1972, it produced sufficient alarm that the United States Senate passed a resolution calling for an international prohibition on weather modification for military purposes. This prohibition was eventually embodied in the Environmental Modification Convention of 1977, which the United States and the Soviet Union both signed. The convention prohibits the hostile use of environmental modification techniques. The convention exists because the concern about weather modification as a weapon was serious enough to require a treaty, not because the concern was imaginary. Cloud seeding is not a secret technology. It is a commercially available service offered by companies in multiple countries
and used by governments and agricultural interests and ski resorts and municipalities around the world. The mechanism involves introducing particles, typically silver iodide or potassium iodide, into clouds in ways that encourage ice crystal formation, which promotes precipitation. The technology has been used since the 1940s, and its effectiveness, while variable and dependent on conditions, is supported by a substantial body of evidence. China has the world's largest cloud seeding program, employing tens of thousands of people and using aircraft, rockets, and ground-based generators to modify precipitation across large areas of the country. This is not a secret. The Chinese government publicizes it. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, known as HARP, is the specific facility that has attracted more sustained conspiratorial attention than any other atmospheric research installation in history. HARP is a high-power radio frequency transmitter located in Alaska that is used to study the ionosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere, where the sun's radiation ionizes gases and produces effects that influence radio wave propagation. The facility was funded by the military during its development and construction and has been used for research relevant to military communications and radar. It was transferred to the University of Alaska in 2015. The research conducted there is published in peer-reviewed scientific literature and presented at academic conferences. The conspiracy theories about HARP cover a range of proposed applications: weather control, earthquake induction, mind control via extremely low-frequency electromagnetic waves, the triggering of specific weather events, including Hurricane Katrina and the 2010 Haiti earthquake. The facility has been credited or blamed with producing most of the significant natural disasters of the past 3 decades by people who understand it to be a weapons system disguised as a research installation. The facility does produce powerful radio frequency transmissions that interact with the ionosphere. The atmospheric effects of these transmissions are local and temporary, and are the subject of the published research rather than being concealed. The specific proposed applications, weather control and earthquake induction, would require mechanisms that the published physics of ionospheric interaction does not support. The genuine history of weather modification research in military contexts provides the legitimate foundation from which the HARP theories are built. The research is real. The military interest in weather modification is documented. The existence of Operation Popeye and the subsequent treaty to prohibit such operations confirms that the military did pursue this capability and that it worked to some degree. The question of whether HARP represents a continuation and enhancement of this capability, rather than what it presents itself as, is a question that the facility's history of military funding and the documented history of military weather modification research has made genuinely available to people who are inclined to ask it. The geoengineering discussion that has emerged in the context of climate change represents the next development in this history, and the one whose relationship to conspiracy theory is most complex. Stratospheric aerosol injection, the proposed deliberate introduction of reflective particles into the stratosphere to reduce solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface and thereby slow warming, is now the subject of serious scientific research, government-funded programs, and significant academic literature. It is not currently being implemented at scale. It is being researched, modeled, and in some cases tested in small-scale experiments. The same mechanism that Operation Popeye used, the deliberate introduction of particles into the atmosphere for strategic purposes, is being proposed at a dramatically larger scale for climate purposes, openly, in the scientific literature. The governance questions surrounding geoengineering research are genuine and serious. Who has the authority to make decisions about modifications to the global atmosphere? What are the risks of unintended consequences in a system as complex as the global climate? What happens to regions whose precipitation patterns are altered by stratospheric interventions designed by and for other regions? These questions do not have satisfactory answers, and the scientific and policy communities are actively wrestling with them. The existence of these unanswered questions, in a domain that is genuinely consequential and genuinely uncertain, creates legitimate space for public concern. The chemtrails theory, which holds that the contrails of ordinary aircraft are in fact chemical or biological agents being deliberately sprayed into the atmosphere, takes the real history of weather modification and the real discussion of geoengineering and extends them into a claim that requires a global coordination of every commercial aircraft fleet that the documented evidence does not support. The real history of military weather modification involved a small number of aircraft on a classified mission The real discussion of geoengineering involves a small number of proposed and experimental deployments. The chemtrails theory requires that every aircraft everywhere is participating in a program of mass atmospheric spraying that the tens of thousands of people who maintain and operate commercial aircraft have not disclosed, despite the fact that many of these people have no particular reason for the loyalty to a program they may not know they are participating in that the theory requires. The weather has been deliberately modified in documented cases. The technology to do so exists and is commercially available. The military interest in the capability is documented and treaty-constrained rather than absent. The research into large-scale atmospheric modification for climate purposes is publicly funded and openly discussed. All of these things are true, and none of them is the same as saying that the weather is being controlled by a coordinated program that is hidden from the public. The line between what the documented history supports and what the theory requires is real. It is thinner in this domain than in most, but it is still there, between the cloud-seeding aircraft and the listening sky. Chapter 12. The screen that shaped the story. There is a story that did not run. Not because it was false. Not because the journalists who knew about it lacked the skill to write it. Not because the evidence was insufficient, but because someone above the level of the journalist made a decision that the story would not appear in the publication where it had been prepared to appear. The journalist may have been told directly that the story was killed. They may have submitted it and received no response, and eventually understood from the silence what the silence meant. They may have been reassigned to something else before the story was finished, in a way that was presented as routine, but that the journalist understood was not. The story did not run. The reason the story did not run was not that it was not newsworthy. The reason was that it was. This happens. It happens with enough regularity and has been documented with enough specificity that the claim that powerful interests sometimes influence what media organizations report is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of a real feature of how media institutions operate, in the presence of ownership concentration, advertiser pressure, regulatory sensitivity, and the specific economic and social relationships that connect media institutions to the other institutions they cover. The investigative journalist Mick Davies documented the phenomenon he called churnalism, the replacement of original reporting with the recycled material of press releases and wire services, in a media environment where the resources for genuine investigation have been systematically reduced. The media scholars Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky developed what they called a propaganda model of media in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, arguing that the structural features of corporate media ownership produced systematic filters on what the media reported and how it reported it, without requiring any explicit coordination or deliberate conspiracy. The propaganda model identifies 5 filters through which news must pass in the institutional media: ownership, the concentration of media in large corporations with interests that extend beyond journalism; advertising, the dependence of media revenues on advertisers who have interests in how their industries and the broader economy are covered; sourcing, the reliance on institutional sources whose access and cooperation media organizations depend on in ways that create incentives to report in ways those sources prefer; flack, the organized criticism and pressure that powerful interests direct at media organizations when coverage displeases them; and anti-communism, in its original formulation, now updated to a more general ideological framework that defines the boundaries of acceptable debate. The model has been criticized on multiple grounds. Critics argue that it underestimates the genuine adversarial journalism that does occur, that it cannot account for the media coverage that does challenge powerful interests, and that sometimes produces significant accountability, and that it treats a complex and varied set of institutions as more uniform in their behavior than they actually are. These criticisms have real force. The model is not a description of total control, but of structural tendencies that shape coverage without determining every story. What the model is describing, and what the documented history of specific stories that were killed or shaped by the pressures it identifies supports, is something that is not the same as a coordinated conspiracy, but produces some of the same effects. The stories that do not run about the industries whose advertising revenue is significant to the publication. The coverage of pharmaceutical products that is measured and careful in ways that coverage of other subjects is not, in publications that depend on pharmaceutical advertising. The deference that many media organizations show to official government positions on national security matters, not because they are instructed to defer, but because the sourcing relationships that produce national security coverage create structural incentives toward deference. These are patterns rather than plans, emergent properties of institutional arrangements rather than the execution of a coordinated agenda. The concentration of media ownership is a documented trend in the United States and in many other countries over the past several decades. The number of companies controlling the majority of American media has decreased substantially across this period. 6 companies control the large majority of what Americans see on television, hear on the radio, and read in major publications and digital platforms. This concentration does not produce a unified editorial agenda in the way that state-controlled media in authoritarian systems might. The companies have competing commercial interests. The journalists they employ have their own professional standards and ethical commitments. The diversity of content within any given media conglomerate is real, but the concentration does produce something. It narrows the range of ownership perspectives that the institutional media represents. It creates common institutional interests among the companies that control the major media channels, interests in regulatory frameworks and tax policy and labor relations that the media organizations will cover. It produces a situation in which the people who make ultimate editorial decisions have access to each other, move in the same social circles, sit on the same boards, and share the perspective of a class of people whose relationship to the world being reported on is not identical to the relationship of the people who will read or watch or listen to the reporting. The story that did not run exists in a complex relationship with the story that did run instead. What replaced the killed story was not necessarily false. It was probably accurate as far as it went. But as far as it went was defined by what the institutional pressures of its production permitted. The story that ran told the truth about what it covered. It may not have covered what would have been most important for the audience to know, because most important and what the institutional pressures permit are not always the same thing. The invisible control that media ownership and advertising dependency and sourcing relationships produce is invisible in the sense that it does not announce itself as control. It does not produce a memo from the owner instructing the editor to kill the story, usually. It produces an environment in which the editor has learned, through years of professional experience, which stories will be supported and which will encounter friction, and makes editorial decisions that reflect this learned knowledge without necessarily understanding them as anything other than sound editorial judgment. The control is built into the structure of what seems normal, rather than imposed on what seems normal. This makes it more effective and makes it harder to see from inside the institutions that embody it. The conspiracy theory version of this describes the control as more complete and more explicit than it is. The image of media owners meeting to decide what will and will not be reported, while having some basis in the documented reality of owner interference in specific cases, overstates the coordination and the intentionality of a process that is mostly structural and mostly invisible to its participants. The actual mechanism is both more mundane and more difficult to address than the conspiracy theory version suggests, because the conspiracy theory version implies that exposing the coordinators would change the system, when the actual system would continue to produce similar patterns even if every participant were replaced by someone with entirely different intentions. The story that runs is not a lie. The story that does not run is not a secret. It is the space between what happened and what was covered, where something real lives quietly and goes unreported. Chapter 13. The Cure They Couldn't Sell. There is a specific logic to this theory that makes it, among conspiracy theories, one of the most intuitively compelling. It does not require a complicated mechanism or an unlikely technology or a hidden network of unusual capabilities. It requires only the observation that the financial incentives of the pharmaceutical industry are organized around the treatment of disease rather than its elimination, combined with the further observation that an industry organized around the treatment of disease would, if it possessed a cure for that disease, face a significant reduction in its revenue from that treatment. The logic is simple enough that most people grasp it immediately. And because the logic is simple and the observation about financial incentives is accurate, the theory feels like it is describing something real, even before any specific evidence for any specific buried cure has been evaluated. The financial incentive observation is accurate. The pharmaceutical industry does generate revenue from the ongoing treatment of chronic conditions in ways that would be reduced if those conditions were cured. A company that develops a treatment for a chronic illness that must be taken indefinitely generates recurring revenue from that treatment for as long as the treatment is prescribed. A company that develops a cure for the same illness generates revenue from the cure once, for the period during which the patent protects it, and then no further revenue from that patient. The incentive structure does not align perfectly with the public health goal of curing disease. This is a real feature of how pharmaceutical markets are organized, and it has real consequences for the kinds of research that pharmaceutical companies prioritize. The documented history of pharmaceutical pricing and access further supports the intuition behind the theory. The same insulin that was developed by researchers who sold the patent for $1 because they believed it should be available to everyone who needed it has, in the American market, been priced in ways that have made it inaccessible to people without adequate insurance, producing a situation in which people with a treatable condition have died for lack of access to a treatment that is neither new nor expensive to manufacture. The pharmaceutical companies that have engaged in this pricing are not engaged in a conspiracy to harm diabetics. They are engaged in the ordinary profit-maximizing behavior that the American pharmaceutical market permits and that their investors expect. The harm is real. The mechanism is structural rather than conspiratorial. The distinction matters for understanding the cause, but does not diminish the harm. Royal Raymond Rife is the figure who appears most frequently in the buried cure literature. Rife was an inventor and scientist who worked in San Diego in the early 20th century, and who claimed to have developed a microscope of extraordinary resolution and, subsequently, a device that used specific frequencies of electromagnetic radiation to destroy specific pathogens and cancer cells. His claims were investigated by the American Medical Association in the 1930s, whose investigators could not replicate his results. His equipment was later examined by researchers who could not verify the mechanisms he described. His papers were lost in circumstances that his supporters have attributed to deliberate destruction by the AMA. He died in 1971. The Rife theory, in its current form, holds that he discovered a genuine cure for cancer that was suppressed by the medical establishment in coordination with pharmaceutical interests, because a cure for cancer would eliminate the revenue generated by cancer treatment. The theory has been sustained across several decades by communities of believers who use devices marketed as Rife machines, none of which has been demonstrated in controlled clinical trials to produce the effects their proponents claim. The FDA has acted against companies marketing these devices with specific therapeutic claims. The honest evaluation of the Rife theory requires acknowledging both what the historical record supports and what it does not. Rife was a real person who did real work. His microscopy claims were investigated and could not be verified by independent researchers, which is the appropriate test for scientific claims. The loss of his papers is documented, though the cause of the loss is disputed. The device that uses his name is marketed in a regulatory environment that requires demonstration of safety and efficacy for medical devices, and the devices have not demonstrated this, which is why the FDA has taken action against specific marketing claims. None of this confirms that his claims were valid. It also does not confirm that they were suppressed by a coordinated effort of the medical establishment. The claim of a suppressed cure for cancer faces a specific structural difficulty that the Rife case illustrates. Cancer is not one disease. It is a category of disease encompassing hundreds of distinct conditions, with distinct mechanisms, distinct genetic profiles, and distinct responses to treatment. The claim that a single frequency-based device could cure cancer in general is making a claim that the biology of cancer, as understood by researchers across the full range of cancer science, does not support. This does not mean that novel treatments cannot be effective against specific cancer types, which they can and do and continue to be developed in academic and commercial research settings. It means that the specific form of the claim, a single modality that cures cancer because cancer is a single thing, is a claim that misunderstands the biology. The genuine history of cancer research does include examples of promising treatments that received inadequate attention or that were initially dismissed by the medical establishment before evidence accumulated in their favor. The discovery that H. pylori bacteria was the primary cause of peptic ulcers rather than stress and excess acid as had been believed was initially rejected by the medical establishment and took many years of advocacy by its discoverers to become accepted. One of those discoverers, Barry Marshall, was so convinced of the bacterial causation that he drank a solution containing H. pylori to demonstrate it could produce ascites, which it did. He eventually won the Nobel Prize for the discovery. The story is a genuine example of the medical establishment's resistance to paradigm-shifting discoveries, and it is sometimes invoked as support for the general principle that important medical discoveries are suppressed. But the H. pylori case is precisely the opposite of the suppression theory in its most important feature. The discovery was not suppressed, it was resisted, which is different. The resistance was eventually overcome by the accumulation of evidence and the advocacy of the researchers who made the discovery. The mechanism by which valid scientific discoveries are adopted, which involves peer review and replication and the gradual accumulation of evidence, is slow and resistant to paradigm shifts in ways that can be frustrating and that have genuine costs. But it is not the same mechanism as deliberate suppression for commercial reasons. The pharmaceutical industry's incentive structure does produce research priorities that are distorted relative to public health needs. This is well documented and is the subject of serious reform proposals from within the academic and public health communities. The specific claim that cures for major diseases have been developed and then buried to protect treatment revenues requires, however, that researchers who develop the cure, the institutions that funded the research, the academic communities that would review it, and the regulatory bodies that would evaluate it all participate in the concealment in ways that exceed what the documented history of pharmaceutical industry influence on these institutions supports. The cure they couldn't sell may exist in the form of treatments that have not received adequate research funding because they cannot be patented. It probably does not exist in the form of a completed cure that is being actively concealed, even if the profit motive that motivates both possibilities is exactly the same. Chapter 14. The Underground World. There is infrastructure beneath your feet right now, not hypothetically, not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the literal and uncontroversial sense of the word infrastructure. Pipes that carry water to the buildings above them and wastewater away from them. Electrical conduits and fiber optic cables and natural gas lines, and the specific tangle of maintenance shafts and utility corridors that constitute the nervous system of any city that has been growing and adding layers to itself for longer than a single generation. In older cities, this infrastructure extends further back than the current surface suggests. The layers of previous cities that archaeological excavation sometimes reveals, the streets and foundations and drainage systems of the city that existed before the current one was built on top of it, are sometimes accessible, sometimes forgotten, sometimes collapsed into the soil, and sometimes preserved with unexpected completeness beneath whatever was built above them. The underground world is real before the theory of it. The theory begins from a real foundation and extends that foundation in directions the physical evidence does not follow. The continuity of government bunker network in the United States is documented, rather than theoretical. The existence of a substantial underground facility beneath the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, intended to house Congress in the event of a nuclear attack, was kept secret for decades and was eventually revealed by the Washington Post in 1992. The facility, known as Project Greek Island, contained a decontamination chamber, dormitories, a cafeteria, medical facilities, and a meeting space that could accommodate the full Congress. It had been maintained in operational readiness from its construction in the late 1950s until the Post's revelation made it effectively unusable as a secret facility. The government built it, the government kept it secret, the Post found it. These are facts. The Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania and Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia are also documented facilities, both classified as FEMA installations, and both intended to serve as relocation sites for executive branch operations in national emergency conditions. Their existence has been publicly acknowledged, though the full extent of their capabilities and the specific preparations they house are not fully public. The concept of a shadow government with its own infrastructure, prepared to maintain continuity of governmental function through scenarios that would interrupt or eliminate the normal government, is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented feature of American Cold War and post-Cold War planning. The question that the conspiracy theory extends from these documented facts is whether the scale of the underground infrastructure is larger than what has been acknowledged, and whether its purposes extend beyond emergency government continuity to something more ambitious. The theory of deep underground military bases, known in the literature as DUMBs, holds that the United States military has constructed, across the country and in some versions globally, a network of underground facilities connected by high-speed transport systems, housing populations that live entirely underground, conducting research and operations that could not be conducted in public facilities, and in some versions, serving as the destination to which the elite will retreat when whatever is coming becomes unsuitable for surface dwelling. The technological argument for the feasibility of such construction is real in the sense that the machines exist. Tunnel boring machines are large and expensive and slow, but they work. And the machines used for large-scale tunneling projects like the Channel or the Large Hadron Collider at CERN demonstrate that significant underground construction is possible with existing technology. The construction of underground facilities at a scale significantly beyond what is publicly acknowledged would require significant resources, significant workforce, and a significant supply chain, all of which would leave traces that the theory must account for as part of the concealment. Philip Schneider is the figure most associated with the dumb theory in its most elaborate form. Schneider claimed to have been a geological engineer involved in the construction of deep underground military bases, and to have survived an encounter with extraterrestrial beings during the construction of a base in Dulce, New Mexico, in 1979. He gave a number of talks in the mid-1990s before his death in 1996, which his supporters attributed to assassination and which the medical examiner attributed to suicide. His claims included a network of over 130 underground bases connected by a high-speed rail system, collaboration and conflict between the American military and alien species, and a coming population control event for which the underground infrastructure was preparation. The claims cannot be verified by external evidence, and most of the specific claims contradict what is known about the locations and institutions he cited. The Dulce base specifically, which Schneider claimed was a joint human-alien facility operating multiple levels underground, with alien species residing in the lower levels, has been investigated by people who have attempted to locate physical evidence of its existence in the area around Dulce, New Mexico. The area is a gas and oil-producing region and does have subsurface industrial infrastructure related to those industries. The specific base as described has not been located, and no credible independent evidence of its existence has been produced. The town of Dulce is a small community on the Jicarilla Apache Nation Reservation, whose residents have varying views on the theory, some finding it an unwanted imposition of outside narratives onto their community, and others finding it economically useful as a source of tourism interest. The Antarctic underground theory holds that significant infrastructure, including possibly an entrance to a hollow Earth or to an extensive subterranean network, exists beneath the Antarctic ice. Antarctica is a continent that is genuinely not fully explored, genuinely contains significant subglacial lakes discovered through ice-penetrating radar, and genuinely is the site of research installations operated by multiple countries under treaty arrangements that restrict certain activities but permit others that are not publicly disclosed in full detail. The subglacial lakes, the most famous of which is Lake Vostok beneath 4 kilometers of ice, are genuinely interesting environments that researchers are actively studying because they may represent isolated ecosystems that have been cut off from the surface world for millions of years. The subglacial geography revealed by radar surveys is genuinely complex and still being mapped. None of this supports the hollow Earth or the significant artificial infrastructure theories, but it does provide the foundation from which those theories can be built by people who are inclined to find in genuine unexplored territories the extensions of what they already believe is hidden beneath the more thoroughly explored portions of the world. The underground world is real. It is also smaller than the theory requires, and more boring, and contains mostly pipes, and the occasional undisclosed government facility, built for exactly the reasons governments build undisclosed facilities, which are consequential reasons, but not the reasons. The deepest version of the theory needs them to be. Chapter 15. The Celebrity Who Never Left. There is a particular quality that attaches to certain deaths that does not attach to others. Not the deaths of ordinary people, whose passing is mourned in private, and whose absence from the world is felt only by the specific and limited circle of people who knew them. The deaths of people who have been through the specific mechanism of modern celebrity, present in the lives of millions of people who never met them. People whose voices or faces or bodies of work have been woven into the texture of other people's experiences, in ways that are real, even though the relationship was entirely one-sided. A fan who has listened to the same album hundreds of times, across 20 years, has a relationship to the artist that is not reciprocal and is not a friendship, and is also not nothing. It is a form of presence that the death of the artist converts into an absence that feels, to the person experiencing it, more significant than the death of many people they have actually known. This felt significance produces a specific vulnerability to the belief that the death did not occur. Not primarily because the evidence for the death is weak, though in some cases the evidence is complicated in ways that provide the theory with its foothold, but because the death of a person who was present in that specific way produces a grief that is difficult to process through the ordinary channels that grief provides. The person who grieves a friend or a family member has other people who share the grief, rituals that provide structure for the processing of it, a relationship that existed in both directions, and whose ending is therefore the ending of something mutually constituted. The fan who grieves a celebrity grieves alone, in a grief that others may not take seriously, for a relationship that existed only on one side. The specific quality of this grief makes the idea that the death was not real a particularly attractive alternative to accepting that it was. Elvis Presley is the originating figure of the celebrity death conspiracy theory in its modern form. He died on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42, of cardiac arrhythmia, in circumstances that involved significant prescription drug use across the years preceding his death. He was found unresponsive at his Graceland estate and was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. He was buried in the Meditation Garden at Graceland, where his grave remains. The theory that he faked his death began circulating almost immediately after the announcement and has been sustained in various forms for more than 4 decades. The specific elements of the theory have varied across its many versions, but tend to cluster around certain recurring claims. The name on the death certificate contained a misspelling of which the theory interprets as a deliberate signal, though misspellings on official documents are not unusual. The body in the open casket at the funeral looked different from Elvis, in ways that suggested it might have been a wax figure or a different person, though the appearance of a body in an open casket after embalming is routinely different from the appearance of the living person. Sightings of Elvis at locations around the country were reported by people who were certain they had seen him, and these sightings have continued for decades, with the specific locations and circumstances varying, but the certainty of the reporters remaining constant. The motivation attributed to Elvis for faking his death has also varied. He wanted to escape the pressure of his fame and the demands of his management. He was in danger from organized crime connections. He was entering witness protection. He wanted to spend his remaining years in peace without the obligations of celebrity. These motivations are psychologically plausible in the sense that the exhaustion of extreme fame and the specific quality of Elvis's last years are well documented, and the idea of wanting to escape the apparatus that his public life had become is not difficult to understand. The plausibility of the motivation does not constitute evidence that the escape was actually executed. Michael Jackson's death in June 2009 produced a similar pattern at accelerated speed, reflecting the compressed timescales that internet communication permits. He was pronounced dead within hours of going into cardiac arrest. The conspiracy theories were circulating within days. The specific claims followed a similar structure. The body was not really his. He had been planning his disappearance. Sightings of him in various locations were reported and circulated. The specific motivations attributed included escape from debt, escape from the legal and public pressures following his 2005 acquittal, and a desire to live privately without the burdens of celebrity. Tupac Shakur's death in September 1996, from gunshot wounds sustained in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas, has generated a conspiracy theory with a different emphasis. The theory does not primarily claim that the shooting was staged. It claims that the wounds were not fatal and that Tupac survived and subsequently relocated. The specific version most frequently cited involves his relocation to Cuba, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. The appeal of this version reflects both the genuine appeal of the escape narrative and the specific political significance of Cuba as a destination for American figures who face state persecution. Given his documented FBI surveillance file and the political content of his music was not entirely a fantasy context. The pattern across these cases has consistent features that illuminate what the theory is doing psychologically. The person who died was, in some documented way, under significant pressure from which escape was plausible as a desire. The circumstances of the death contained at least one element that was ambiguous enough to provide a foothold for doubt. The person's public presence had been significant enough that their absence is genuinely felt by a substantial population. and the alternative to accepting the death, the alternative in which the person chose to leave rather than being taken, resolves the grief into something closer to understanding a decision than mourning a loss. The decision is easier to live with than the loss. The person who chose to go is still, in some sense, out there. The relationship that felt real because the music was real and the performances were real and the decades of presence in a fan's life were real has not been ended by something that the fan had no control over. It has been changed by something the famous person chose, which at least respects the agency of someone whose agency had been so thoroughly constrained by the machinery of celebrity that the constrained person was not, by the end, entirely recognizable as the person who had first become famous. The celebrity who never left is still absent from the world in every practical sense. The music that was left behind does not change depending on whether the musician is in Kalamazoo or in a grave in Memphis. But the grief that lives in the person who listened finds in the possibility of the escape something that the possibility of the death does not provide, which is the sense that the person they loved made a choice rather than having one made for them.
Chapter 16, The Number That Keeps Appearing.
There is a date that appears in a document you did not expect to find it in. You notice it because you have been noticing it for months, in other documents, in other contexts, in the small coincidences of daily life that you have begun to collect without quite deciding to collect them. The date appeared on a receipt 2 months ago, and you thought nothing of it. Then it appeared as the timestamp on a photograph you found while going through old files, and you noted it with mild interest. Then it appeared as an address, and then as the running time of a film, and then as the number of pages in a book you picked up at random. And by this point, the mild interest has become something else. Something that feels like the edge of a pattern, like the corner of something larger that the individual sightings are collectively pointing toward. The pattern feels real. The feeling of the pattern is specific and physical and does not feel like imagination. And this, the feeling itself, is the most important thing to understand about what is happening. The feeling is not evidence that the pattern is real in the sense of being designed by anyone. The feeling is evidence that the brain is doing exactly what the brain does with sequences of experience that it decides to track. And the deciding, crucially, happened before the tracking became conscious. The brain filed the date somewhere in the attention system after the first occurrence, for reasons that may have had nothing to do with the date itself, and everything to do with the context in which it first appeared. And then the brain, because it was now tracking the date, noticed it everywhere it subsequently appeared. And the subsequent appearances were not unusual. They were happening at the same rate they had always been happening. The brain was simply now attending to them in a way it had not been attending to them before. This is the mechanism the psychologists call confirmation bias, operating in the specific domain of numerical attention. But the term confirmation bias does not fully capture what is happening because the word confirmation implies that a belief was being confirmed. What is happening is more primitive than confirmation. It is the operation of an attention filter that has been set to a specific frequency, and the filter is now receiving everything at that frequency that had always been there but was previously passing unnoticed. The number 23 became famous or infamous in a specific way when the writer William Burroughs became convinced that the number had a special significance after a series of coincidences involving it. The belief spread through certain counterculture communities and produced what is sometimes called the 23 Enigma, a half-serious, half-playful tradition of finding 23 everywhere and treating the findings as meaningful. The film, The Number 23, was made about a man who becomes obsessed with the number. The philosopher Robert Anton Wilson wrote extensively about it. The tradition became sufficiently well established that it illustrated something that its participants were sometimes aware of and sometimes not, which is that if you are looking for 23, you will find it. You will find it because you are looking for it. The same would apply to 17, or 11, or 47, or any other number you chose to track with the same intensity. The confirmation bias in numerical pattern detection is exploited, sometimes deliberately and sometimes through its natural operation, in the construction of what is called numerology in its various forms. Numerology is the belief that numbers have inherent significance that is expressed in the natural and historical world, and that decoding the numerical patterns in names, dates, and events reveals hidden truths about the nature of reality and the intentions of hidden actors. The practice is ancient, appearing in forms across multiple cultures and religious traditions. And the patterns it finds are genuinely present in the sense that the numbers are genuinely there. What the practice cannot establish is that the patterns were placed there rather than found. The 9/11 numerology that developed in the years after September 11, 2001, is an example of this at scale. The attacks occurred on 9/11. The emergency telephone number in the United States is 911. The flight numbers of the aircraft involved were American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, and American Airlines Flight 77 and United Airlines Flight 93. The World Trade Center towers were the tallest buildings in New York for a period. The number of days between various related events, when calculated in certain ways and measured from certain starting points, produce numbers that appear meaningful. These patterns are real as arithmetic. The question of whether they were placed there by the conspirators as a kind of signature, or whether they represent the normal distribution of numbers in a complex event that a pattern-seeking mind is organizing into significance after the fact, is the question that the felt sense of the pattern does not answer. The problem is that the felt sense of the pattern is strong and specific and physical, and feels like perception rather than construction. And in a domain where the difference between genuine pattern and constructed pattern cannot be resolved by the feeling of pattern, the feeling is not the tool that distinguishes them. The tool that distinguishes them is the test of whether the pattern would be expected by chance at approximately the rate at which it is being found, which requires the kind of statistical reasoning that the emotionally compelling feeling of the pattern actively discourages. Gematria, the practice of assigning numerical values to letters and finding significance in the resulting sums, is one of the oldest forms of this pattern finding and is embedded in multiple religious traditions, including Jewish mysticism and certain strands of Christian numerology. In its religious contexts, the practice is understood as a method of finding layers of meaning in sacred texts that transcend their surface content. In its conspiracy theory applications, the same methodology is applied to names and dates and events to find the numerical signatures of the hidden actors. The specific numbers that reveal the involvement of the Illuminati are the Freemasons, or whatever entity is proposed as the architect of the events being decoded. The specific number or pattern that any individual conspiracy theory focuses on tends to have been chosen retroactively from a range of numbers that were available in the relevant documents and events. When the chosen number is found, it is presented as evidence of deliberate placement. The numbers that were available but not chosen are not presented because they were not chosen and therefore do not appear in the analysis. This selection process, in which a number is found because it was looked for in a domain that contains all numbers, produces the feeling of discovery without the structure of discovery. The number that keeps appearing is appearing because you are counting, and what you are counting, it turns out, was always there. In the same quantity, it was always there, waiting for something to start attending, which is what the attention eventually does when something gives it a reason to start looking for a specific thing in a world that contains all things.
Chapter 17. The technology ahead of its time.
There is an engine and a filing cabinet somewhere. Not literally, and not in any specific filing cabinet that can be identified, but in the version of history that the suppressed technology theory holds to be accurate, the filing cabinet is where it ended up. The engine ran on water, or on a fuel so cheap as to be effectively free, or on a form of energy extracted from the vacuum of space itself, and it worked. The person who built it demonstrated that it worked. And then someone arrived, or something happened, or a phone call came from someone whose phone number did not appear in any directory, and the engine stopped being something that anyone outside a small circle knew had ever existed. The filing cabinet closed. The patent was denied or bought or buried. The inventor received either a payment or a warning, and sometimes in the stories both. And the technology that would have changed everything became the technology that changed nothing, because it never reached the world. Nikola Tesla is the presiding figure over this territory, and with reason that is more substantial than the pure mythology that has accumulated around him. Tesla was a genuine genius whose contributions to the development of alternating current systems are foundational to the electrical infrastructure of the modern world. He was also, in the last decades of his life, working on projects of genuinely uncertain feasibility, including a system he called the World Wireless System, or Wardenclyffe, which he described as a method for transmitting electrical power wirelessly through the Earth. He was funded for a period by J.P. Morgan, who withdrew funding when it became clear that the project could not be monetized in ways that Morgan's investment required. Tesla died in poverty in a New York hotel room in 1943, and the papers he left behind were seized by the Office of Alien Property in the days following his death. The seizure of Tesla's papers is documented. The FBI's interest in his work, particularly in light of the Wardenclyffe project's potential military applications, is documented. The papers were eventually evaluated by scientists at MIT who concluded that the weapons applications were not feasible with the technology of the time. Some of the papers were later released to his home country of Yugoslavia and are now held in a museum in Belgrade. The suppression theory holds that what was released was not the full record, that the genuinely important documents were retained or destroyed, and that the technology they described would have been transformative in ways that the institutions that controlled it did not want transformed. The honest evaluation of this requires separating what is documented from what is inferred. The seizure is documented. The evaluation is documented. The conclusion of the evaluators is documented. The claim that the evaluators were wrong, that the technology was feasible and was suppressed because of its implications, is not documented. It is inferred from the gap between what Tesla claimed and what the subsequent evaluation found, with the inference going in the direction that the suppression theory requires. The gap is real. The inference is one possible explanation for the gap and not the only possible one. The water-powered car is one of the most persistent claims in the suppressed technology literature and represents a category of claim that is different from the Tesla case in an important way. Stanley Meyer claimed in the 1990s to have developed a device that could power a vehicle on water through a process that produced hydrogen from water at a rate that exceeded what the energy input to the electrolysis process should have permitted. He demonstrated his device to journalists and investors and received significant publicity. He died in 1998 at a restaurant in Grove City, Ohio, and his death was attributed to a brain aneurysm. His supporters attribute it to poisoning by agents of the oil industry. The specific claim that Meyer's device produced more energy from the electrolysis of water than was required to run the electrolysis process is a claim that violates the conservation of energy, which is one of the most thoroughly tested principles in physics. This does not mean that the claim is impossible in an absolute sense. It means that any claim to have demonstrated it would need to be verified by independent testing under controlled conditions that eliminate the possibility of measurement error. The testing that was done on Meyer's device by experts who examined it found that it did not perform as claimed when measurement conditions were controlled. This is the appropriate test for such a claim, and the test produced the result that the physics would predict. The suppressed electric vehicle is a claim with more historical complexity. The General Motors EV1 was an electric vehicle produced in the late 1990s under California's zero-emission vehicle mandate. It was leased, not sold, to a limited number of customers in California and Arizona. When GM terminated the program in 2002, it recalled and destroyed almost all of the EV1s over the objection of customers who wanted to purchase them, and despite petitions and protests from the vehicle's users, who reported high satisfaction with the vehicle's performance. The documentary film, Who Killed the Electric Car, examined the circumstances of the EV1's termination and the various actors whose interests were served by it. The suppression of the EV1 is not a theory in the same sense as the Meyer water car or the Tesla free energy device. The vehicle existed in substantial numbers. Its performance was documented. Its termination was a corporate decision made in a context where the California zero-emission vehicle mandate had been weakened, where GM had significant investments in conventional vehicle technology, and where the oil industry had interests in preventing the adoption of vehicles that would reduce fuel consumption. The question of whether the EV1 was terminated because of pressure from those interests, rather than for the reasons GM stated, is a legitimate question about corporate decision-making, whose answer the available documentary record supports in part. The distinction between the EV1 case and the water car case is the distinction between a technology that existed, was suppressed for documented reasons related to interests that the suppression served, and was eventually replaced by later electric vehicle development, and a technology that was claimed to exist but could not be verified under controlled conditions, and whose suppression therefore may be the explanation for why it never reached the world, or may be the thing that happened instead of a working device that the fraudulent demonstration implied. Both stories get told as suppressed technology stories. They are not the same kind of story. The pattern that the suppressed technology literature reveals is the same pattern that runs through most conspiracy theory literature. A real phenomenon, the corporate or institutional suppression of technologies whose adoption would harm incumbent interests, provides the foundation. From that foundation, the theory extends into claims that the available evidence does not support, applying the documented mechanism to technologies whose claimed properties are not consistent with established physics, and whose suppression would have required a coordination of interests across industries and national boundaries that the documented history of technology suppression has not demonstrated. The filing cabinet is real. Some things were put in it that should not have been. The engine that ran on water is not one of them. But the desire to believe it is not stupid. It is the desire to believe that the world could have been different, and that the reason it is not is that someone chose to keep it this way. Chapter 18. The map with the wrong edges.
There is a photograph taken in 1972 by the crew of Apollo 17 on their way to the moon. It shows the Earth as a fully illuminated sphere against the blackness of space. The African continent visible at the center, Antarctica white at the bottom, clouds spiraling across the blue surface of a world that is unmistakably round. The photograph is called the Blue Marble, and it is one of the most reproduced images in history. It hangs in classrooms and offices and appears on the screens of devices around the world. It is the image that, more than any other single image, has provided the visual confirmation of something that human beings had understood mathematically and observationally for more than 2,000 years. The Earth is a sphere. It is this shape. Here it is. You can see it. The image has not resolved the question for everyone. The Flat Earth movement, which existed in various forms throughout the modern period, but underwent a significant resurgence in the years following the widespread adoption of social media, holds that the blue marble and every other image of a spherical Earth is a fabrication produced by NASA and the other space agencies and the governments that fund them, as part of a conspiracy whose purpose is disputed, but whose existence is required by the theory. The Earth in this view is a disk. The center of the disk is the Arctic, which is accessible. The edge of the disk is Antarctica, which is a wall of ice encircling the flat surface, and which is monitored and patrolled by the same agencies and governments that produce the fake images of a spherical Earth to prevent the disk's inhabitants from discovering the shape of the world they live on. The blue marble being a fabrication requires that the Apollo 17 astronauts who took it, and the teams that processed and distributed it, and the tens of thousands of people involved in the Apollo program, and the scientists who have subsequently used the satellite imagery that confirms the spherical geometry of the Earth in their work, and the GPS system whose functioning depends on the mathematics of a spherical planet, and the airline and shipping industries whose navigation systems are based on the same mathematics, and the astronomers who observe other spherical planetary bodies through their telescopes, and who would have professional reasons to notice if the Earth were different, all be either deceived or complicit. The theory does not resolve this problem, it incorporates it. Everyone who knows the Earth is a sphere is either deceived or part of the conspiracy. The absence of evidence for the disk model is the evidence for the effectiveness of the spherical model's imposition. The ship that disappears hull first over the horizon, which is the visual demonstration of the Earth's curvature that humans observed long before they had the means to photograph the planet from space, is explained in flat Earth theory as a perspective effect, in which the ship is not disappearing over a curve, but is moving beyond the range of the eye's effective resolution, and can be recovered in view with a sufficiently powerful zoom lens. The zoom lens recovery of distant ships is demonstrated in videos that circulate in flat Earth communities and is presented as refutation of the hull first disappearance evidence. The demonstrations are real. What they are demonstrating is the recovery of detail at the level of the hull in conditions where atmospheric refraction and the limits of the unaided eye produce the appearance of hull first disappearance. They do not demonstrate that the disappearance itself was a perspective effect rather than a curvature effect, and they do not explain why the bottom of the ship appears before the top when the telescope is zoomed out, which the curvature model predicts and the perspective model does not. The hollow Earth is a separate and older theory with a different history. The idea that the interior of the Earth is hollow and habitable, rather than composed of molten rock and iron as the geological evidence indicates, has appeared in multiple cultural traditions
and has been developed in more elaborate forms by a series of figures across the modern period. John Cleves Symmes Jr. proposed in 1818 that the Earth was hollow with openings at the poles, and campaigned to have a polar expedition organized to find the openings. The proposal was not funded. Jules Verne wrote a novel involving a journey to the Earth's interior. The Nazis and some versions of the Hollow Earth theory conducted expeditions to Antarctica to find the polar entrance and establish contact with the advanced civilization presumed to inhabit the interior. The contemporary Hollow Earth theory holds that the inner world is accessible through polar entrances, is populated by either a more advanced human civilization or by beings who are not human, and has been known to and concealed by the governments that have conducted polar expeditions. The seismological evidence that has accumulated across more than a century of earthquake monitoring is the principal evidence against the Hollow Earth. The way seismic waves travel through the Earth and the way their behavior changes at different depths is consistent with the known properties of molten iron and rock, and is not consistent with a hollow space. The seismological community is an international one whose members have conducted this research without producing a unified finding that the interior is hollow. The Hollow Earth theory must account for this by either claiming that seismology is wrong, which requires explaining the mechanism by which all the seismological predictions are nevertheless accurate despite being based on incorrect models, or by claiming that seismologists are also part of the conspiracy. The psychological question that both theories pose is more interesting than the factual question, because the factual question is settled in ways that the psychological question is not. Why does the shape of the planet remain genuinely in doubt for people who have access to the evidence that settles it? The answer is not primarily about the evidence. It is about the relationship to institutions and to the claim of institutional authority. The person who accepts the spherical Earth is accepting the testimony of institutions, the schools that taught it, the textbooks that depicted it, the governments that funded the space agencies that produced the images, the scientific community whose consensus supports it. For a person whose relationship to these institutions is characterized by distrust, the evidence those institutions provide does not function as evidence in the ordinary sense. It functions as further testimony from a source that has already been judged unreliable or dishonest. The spherical Earth becomes evidence of what the institutions are willing to say, rather than evidence of what the Earth is. The flat Earth belief is often less about the flat Earth than about the relationship to institutional authority, the community that forms around it, the specific solidarity of people who know something that the mainstream dismisses, the identity of the person who sees through what others accept, the practice of doing one's own research against the advice of experts. These are features of the belief system that are independent of the specific shape of the planet, and that persist after the specific claim has been engaged with and found wanting. The map with the wrong edges is less a claim about geography, and more a claim about who gets to draw the map, and whether the people who have always drawn it can be trusted. Chapter 19. The Identity Behind the Face. There is a stretch of years in a biography that resists the kind of documentation that the years before and after it produce. Not because nothing happened in those years. Lives are rarely without event across any significant span of time, but because what happened in those years did not generate the paper trail that other periods of the same life generated. School records, employment records, social connections with people who remember the person from that time and can speak to who they were and what they did and how they moved through the world. The absence of this documentation is sometimes entirely ordinary. People move, lose touch, change names through marriage or legal process, live in ways that do not produce extensive records. The absence is also sometimes the beginning of a question that does not resolve easily. The question is not whether the person in question experienced a period of their life that is not well documented. Most lives have such periods. The question is whether the specific configuration of the absence, the particular years that are unclear, the specific documents that are missing or sealed, the precise gaps in the record, correspond to something that the person or the institutions around them had reason to want obscured. This is a question that legitimate journalism asks and that conspiracy theory also asks, and the two are distinguished not by the question but by the standard of evidence required before the question is answered. Barry Obama's birth certificate is the most extensively documented and litigated example of this kind of question in recent American political history. The question of whether Barack Obama was born in the United States, which is a constitutional requirement for the presidency, was raised publicly before his election and persisted throughout his presidency. It was raised by political opponents with varied degrees of sincerity, and by a significant portion of the Republican electorate who reported in polling that they believed or were uncertain whether the president had been born outside the country. The question was answered with the release of the short-form birth certificate from the state of Hawaii in 2008 and the long-form birth certificate in 2011, documents that were authenticated by Hawaiian state officials and by independent document examiners, and that were consistent with all other available evidence about the circumstances of Obama's birth. The conspiracy theory did not end with the release of the documents. It extended into claims that the documents themselves were forged, that the Hawaiian officials who authenticated them were complicit in the forgery, that the newspaper announcements of the birth that appeared in Hawaiian newspapers in August 1961 were inserted retroactively, and that the broader project of concealing his foreign birth had been ongoing since before his birth, in anticipation of his eventual political career. The last of these claims illustrates the specific feature of unfalsifiable conspiracy theories that has appeared throughout this series. The evidence produced to answer the question is incorporated into the theory as evidence of the sophistication of the cover-up, rather than as evidence against the theory. The pattern of the biographical gap is not unique to political figures and does not always involve birthplace. It involves the reconstruction of a public identity from a documented past in ways that seem to leave certain questions unanswered. Lee Harvey Oswald's biography contains genuine ambiguities that have generated sustained scrutiny across 6 decades. His defection to the Soviet Union, his time in Minsk, his relatively smooth return to the United States without the difficulties that Cold War defectors typically encountered, his activities in New Orleans, and his contacts with anti-Castro Cuban exiles, his presence in Mexico City in the weeks before the assassination, his employment at the Texas School Book Depository. None of these elements is fabricated. They are all documented. The questions they raise are not about whether the documentation is real, but about what the documentation assembled as a sequence implies about what Oswald was and for whom he was working, if anyone. The Warren Commission, which conducted the official investigation into the Kennedy assassination, concluded that Oswald acted alone. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which reinvestigated the case in the late 1970s, concluded on the basis of acoustic evidence that a second shooter was probably present in Dealey Plaza. The acoustic evidence was subsequently contested by a panel convened by the National Academy of Sciences. The documentary record of Oswald's biography continues to be examined by researchers who find in it either the coherent, if erratic life of a troubled and politically motivated individual, or the fragmentary traces of an operational identity constructed for purposes that the full record has not disclosed. The constructed identity is a real phenomenon in the context of intelligence operations. The legend, the documented backstory created for an agent who is operating under a false identity, is a documented feature of intelligence tradecraft. The KGB created legends. The CIA created legends. The operations in which these legends were deployed left traces in the documentary record that subsequent investigation has sometimes found. The existence of this practice, and the documented cases in which people were operating in the world under constructed identities for intelligence purposes, provides the foundation from which the theory that certain public figures are operating under constructed identities is built. The theory extends well beyond the cases where the evidence supports it. The claim that a given political figure's biography was constructed by intelligence agencies requires specific evidence that the biography is inconsistent with the documentary record, that the documentary record has been manipulated, and that the manipulation serves the interests of an identifiable intelligence operation. These are high evidentiary standards that the genuine biographical gaps in most public figures' histories do not meet. The gap in the record is common. The gap as evidence of construction requires more than the gap itself. The celebrity version of this theory tends to focus on inconsistencies in publicly available documentation and on physical characteristics that appear to change across photographs in ways that the theory interprets as evidence that the person in the later photographs is not the same person as the person in the earlier ones. The claim that a celebrity was replaced by a lookalike at some point in their career, sometimes attributed to a death that was covered up, and sometimes to a more deliberate substitution, is generated by the photographic inconsistencies that the ordinary variations in a person's appearance across time and circumstances produce. Human faces change. Lighting changes faces. Weight changes change faces. Aging changes faces. The brain's powerful face recognition system, trained to detect subtle differences, can produce the strong impression of a different face when the differences are the product of time rather than identity. The gap in the record is real. Some gaps were deliberately created, most were not, and the human mind, confronted with the absence, where the documentation should be, finds it very difficult to leave the absence as just an absence, rather than as the shape of something that was removed. Chapter 20. The experiment nobody consented to. There's a form that exists in medical and research contexts that most people in the modern world have signed without reading carefully. The informed consent form.
It says in language that varies in clarity depending on the institution and the context, that you understand what is being done to you, that you understand the risks, and that you are agreeing voluntarily to participate. The form is a product of a specific and not very old history. It is the product of the recognition, achieved painfully across the 20th century through a series of documented cases whose details were sometimes not revealed until decades after they occurred, that people who have power over other people will use that power to conduct experiments on those people without their knowledge or agreement, and that the people who conduct such experiments will find ways to justify this to themselves that the people being experimented on would not find persuasive if they knew what was happening. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 in the aftermath of the Nazi medical experiments that were documented at the Nuremberg trials, was the first formal articulation of the principle that voluntary consent is the essential prerequisite for any human experiment. The code was established because the experiments had occurred and the people who conducted them had not believed they were doing anything that required external constraint. The constraint had to be imposed from outside because the internal judgment of the experimenters was insufficient. The United States signed the Nuremberg Code and then, within years of signing it, conducted programs of human experimentation that violated its principles. This is not a theory, it is the documented record. The Tuskegee study has appeared earlier in this series and is worth revisiting in the specific context of the experiment nobody consented to, because it is the longest-running and most thoroughly documented case of government-sponsored non-consensual human experimentation in American history. 400 black men with syphilis were enrolled in a study and denied treatment for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, while researchers observed the progression of the untreated disease. The men were told they were receiving treatment. They were not. When penicillin became the established cure for syphilis in the 1940s, the decision was made to continue denying them treatment so that the study could continue. The study continued for 3 decades after the cure was available. It was ended only because a public health service whistleblower named Peter Buxton, who had raised concerns about the study internally and been dismissed, took the story to the Associated Press in 1972. The story was published. The study was ended. The surviving participants and the families of participants who had died received a settlement. The mistrust of medical institutions among Black Americans that the study produced and that the revelation confirmed is not irrational. It is the appropriate response to documented evidence that the medical institutions in question conducted this program. MKUltra has also appeared earlier in this series and deserves the same revisiting. The program ran from 1953 to 1973 and involved the CIA funding research into the possibility of mind control using LSD and other drugs, hypnosis, psychological techniques including sleep deprivation and sensory deprivation, and other methods. The research involved experiments on people who did not consent to participate and who were not told what was being done to them. Some of the subjects were patients in psychiatric institutions. Some were prisoners. Some were ordinary citizens who were given drugs in social settings without their knowledge, in research that CIA employees conducted under cover of a safe house program called Operation Midnight Climax. The program director, Richard Helms, ordered the destruction of most MKUltra records in 1973 when he learned that a congressional investigation was imminent. The approximately 20,000 documents that survived the destruction were found in a CIA records facility in 1977 and formed the basis of the Senate investigation that produced the most complete account of the program. The radiation experiments conducted on American civilians and military personnel from the 1940s through the 1970s represent another documented chapter of non-consensual human experimentation by the United States government.
The full scope of these experiments was revealed by an advisory committee on human radiation experiments established by President Clinton in 1994, which reviewed hundreds of experiments conducted over decades. The experiments included the injection of plutonium into patients who were told they were receiving cancer treatment. They included the exposure of military personnel to radiation from nuclear tests without adequate protection or informed consent, for the purpose of observing the effects of radiation exposure on military performance. They included the feeding of radioactive oatmeal to institutionalized children, conducted by researchers at MIT and the Quaker Oats Company, in a study presented to the children and their parents as a nutrition study rather than a radiation experiment. The advisory committee's final report acknowledged that many of the experiments were conducted without meaningful consent, that the subjects were frequently members of populations with limited power, including prisoners, institutionalized people, patients, and military personnel who could not effectively refuse, and that the ethical standards that should have governed the research were frequently not applied. The report also noted that the full scope of the experiments could not be established because records had been destroyed or were classified in ways that prevented comprehensive review. Project SHAD, which stood for Shipboard Hazard and Defense, was a series of tests conducted by the United States military from the 1960s into the 1970s, in which American military personnel were deliberately exposed to chemical and biological agents, including nerve agents and bacteria, without their knowledge or consent. The tests were conducted on ships at sea with crews who were not told what they were being exposed to. The existence of the tests was declassified in 2002, and veterans who participated in them were subsequently provided with medical screening and access to health care for conditions that might be related to the exposures. The documentation of these programs is not a reason to conclude that every claim of government human experimentation is true. It is a reason to conclude that the question of whether a government has been conducting experiments on populations without consent is a question that the historical record requires be taken seriously rather than dismissed as inherently implausible. The plausibility of the claim for any specific proposed experiment depends on the evidence for that specific claim, not on the prior probability established by the documented cases. The documented cases establish that the prior probability is not 0. They do not establish that it is 1. The consent form is a product of the experiments. The experiments produce the consent form, because the experiments were real, and the people who conducted them did not stop themselves. Chapter 21. The space they won't show you. There is a region of the electromagnetic spectrum that the human eye cannot access, and that required the development of instruments to reveal. Before infrared telescopes, before radio telescopes, before the instruments that detect X-rays and gamma rays and ultraviolet radiation and microwave emissions, the universe that humanity could observe was the universe that could be seen with the eye, either directly or through optical magnification. This was already an enormous universe by any human scale of reference, but it was a fraction of what existed. The rest was there, emitting in frequencies that the eye could not receive, sending information through the universe in forms that the eye was not built to process. The universe was full of things that were invisible, not because they were hidden, but because the instrument for seeing them had not yet been built. The instruments were eventually built. The universe expanded. Not literally, though it does that too, but in terms of what was accessible to human observation. Each new observational technology revealed phenomena that had been present all along, and that completely changed the understanding of what the universe contained. The radio universe, mapped across the 20th century, contained pulsars and quasars and the cosmic microwave background radiation that is the afterglow of the Big Bang, none of which optical astronomy had access to. The X-ray universe contained black holes and neutron stars and the hot gas of galaxy clusters. The universe that human beings can now observe is enormously richer than the universe that was observable before these instruments existed, and it would be remarkable if it were not the case that there is more still to be revealed by instruments not yet built. The question of what the instruments have found that has not been disclosed is the question around which this chapter is organized, and it is a question that the documented history of classification of space-related information gives more purchase than it would have in a domain without that history. The National Reconnaissance Office conducts satellite reconnaissance from orbit. This is publicly acknowledged. The capabilities of the satellites it operates are classified. The images they produce are classified, at least in their full resolution and in the contexts in which they are collected. The NRO does release declassified imagery under specific circumstances, and has done so with historical images that are no longer operationally sensitive. The existence of classified satellite imagery of terrestrial locations is not controversial. What can be seen from orbit and what has been seen from orbit by systems whose capabilities are not public is a matter of genuine uncertainty for anyone without the relevant clearances. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, known as AATIP, was a classified program of the United States Department of Defense that ran from 2007 to 2012, funded at approximately $22 million per year, and focused on the investigation of what were called unidentified aerial phenomena. The program's existence was disclosed in 2017 by a New York Times investigation, along with the existence of videos taken by Navy pilots that showed objects exhibiting flight characteristics that were not consistent with any known aircraft. The disclosure was followed by a period of increasing government acknowledgement of the phenomenon, including the establishment of additional formal investigation programs, testimony from military personnel before congressional committees, and the release of a formal report to Congress in 2021 that acknowledged the reality of the observed phenomena while declining to provide explanations for them. The Pentagon's acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena represents a significant shift from the previous official position, which had generally been to dismiss reports of anomalous aerial objects as misidentifications or psychological phenomena. The shift was not in the direction of claiming that the objects are of extraterrestrial origin, which remains unconfirmed. It was in the direction of acknowledging that the objects are real, that their flight characteristics in some cases exceed the known capabilities of any nation's aerospace technology, and that the question of what they are warrants serious investigation rather than dismissal. The Fermi paradox is the background against which all of these discussions occur. Enrico Fermi, at a lunch conversation in 1950, posed a question that has not been satisfactorily answered in the 7 decades since. Given the age of the universe, the number of stars, the number of planets that orbit stars and conditions that might permit life, and the relative ease with which a civilization that develops spacefaring technology should be able to spread across the galaxy over timescales that are short by cosmic standards, where is everyone? The absence of confirmed evidence of extraterrestrial civilization is puzzling, given the apparent conditions that should make such civilizations probable. The puzzlement is genuine and is the subject of serious scientific literature that explores a range of possible explanations, from civilizations being rarer than expected, to civilizations being common but not communicating in ways we can detect, to civilizations being common and detectable, but their signals being in forms we have not yet recognized. The SETI program, which searches for radio signals of potential extraterrestrial origin, has operated since the 1960s and has not found confirmed evidence of intentional extraterrestrial transmission. The WOW signal, detected in 1977 at the Big Ear Radio Telescope, was a strong narrowband radio signal that matched the expected profile of an interstellar transmission, and that has not been detected again despite subsequent searches. It remains unexplained. The explanation most favored by researchers who have examined it is a hydrogen cloud or a comet, though neither explanation has been fully confirmed. The signal has been used as evidence by people who believe extraterrestrial signals have been detected and not disclosed, and as evidence of the limitations of the SETI program by people who believe the search methodology requires expansion. The dark side of the moon is not dark in the sense of being unilluminated. It receives sunlight in the same proportion as the near side, which it does. It is called the dark side because it faces away from the Earth and was not observed by any instrument until the Soviet Luna 3 spacecraft photographed it in 1959. The images showed a heavily cratered surface significantly different in character from the near side. The near side has extensive dark plains called Maria that are the result of ancient volcanic flooding. The far side is almost entirely highland terrain with very few Maria. The reason for this difference is not fully understood and is the subject of current research. Various proposed explanations involve differences in the thickness of the lunar crust and the different impact histories of the two sides. The space that is not shown is partly the space that the current instruments cannot access, and partly the space whose access is controlled by classification decisions made by military and intelligence agencies that have legitimate security interests in the capabilities of their orbital systems. The gap between what has been observed and what has been disclosed is real. The gap between what has been disclosed and what the conspiracy theories propose has been withheld is where the evidence becomes thin, and the inference runs ahead of what the documented record supports. The sky contains things the eye cannot see. Some of them are known and classified. Some of them are unknown and being investigated. And some of them are simply out there, emitting in frequencies that the instruments being built today will eventually learn to receive. Chapter 22: The Financial System and Its Quiet Architects. There is a meeting that takes place 8 times a year in a building in Washington, whose address is publicly known and whose decisions are announced in press releases that appear on a website that anyone can access. The meeting is of the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets the federal funds rate,
The interest rate that influences the cost of borrowing across the entire American economy, and through the dollar's role in international finance, across much of the global economy as well. The people in the room are not elected. They are appointed to a process that involves the President and the Senate, but that places them at a considerable remove from democratic accountability.
The decisions they make affect the mortgage payments and the employment prospects and the savings returns of hundreds of millions of people who had no direct voice in selecting them and who can exert no direct pressure on their decisions. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how the Federal Reserve System was designed to work. The insulation of central bank decisions from direct democratic pressure was a deliberate design choice, made on the grounds that monetary policy decisions require technical expertise and long time horizons that democratic politics, with its short electoral cycles and its susceptibility to popular pressure for short-term economic relief, does not reliably provide. The design choice is contestable and has been contested since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913.
The contest involves real questions about democratic accountability and the distribution of economic power that are not resolved by the observation that the design was deliberate. The Federal Reserve's founding in 1913 is itself the subject of conspiracy theory in a form that has persisted for more than a century. The story, whose most influential telling is G. Edward Griffin's 1994 book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, holds that the Federal Reserve was secretly designed by a small group of major bankers at a clandestine meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia, in 1910, with the specific purpose of establishing a banking cartel that would control the American money supply for the benefit of the participating banks and at the expense of the American public.
The meeting on Jekyll Island is documented rather than invented. A group of bankers and government officials did meet there secretly to develop the legislative framework that would become the Federal Reserve Act. The participants included Nelson Aldrich, who was the Senate Republican leader, and representatives of major banking houses including J.P. Morgan, Kuhn Loeb, and National City Bank. The documented reality of the Jekyll Island meeting provides the foundation for the theory, which then extends beyond what the documentation supports. The design of the Federal Reserve was significantly influenced by banking interests, as any honest account of its legislative history reveals. This is different from claiming that it was designed as a secret mechanism for the extraction of wealth from the American public, which is the claim that the theory requires. The Federal Reserve has been the subject of extensive academic economic research that does not support the characterization of its operations as a wealth extraction mechanism, while also identifying genuine ways in which its institutional design and operational decisions have benefited the financial sector at the expense of broader economic welfare. The difference between these two characterizations matters for understanding what the institution is and how it might be reformed. The claim that economic crises are scheduled events, that recessions and depressions and financial panics are deliberately induced by people who control the money supply and who profit from the disruption they create, is the version of this theory that makes the most specific claim about mechanism. It holds that the people who control the financial system are capable of producing economic downturns by contracting the money supply, or withdrawing liquidity, or engineering specific failures, and that they exercise this capability for profit and for the consolidation of power that economic disruption permits. The Great Depression is the most commonly cited example, with the Federal Reserve's decision to allow the money supply to contract after the 1929 stock market crash cited as evidence of deliberate inducement rather than policy error. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's 1963 study, A Monetary History of the United States,
documented the Federal Reserve's failure to prevent the contraction of the money supply in the early 1930s, and argued that this failure transformed what might have been a significant but manageable recession into the Great Depression. Their analysis has been widely accepted by economists across the political spectrum and was acknowledged by Ben Bernanke, who served as Federal Reserve Chairman during the 2008 financial crisis, as a significant influence on his own decision-making during that crisis. The Friedman-Schwartz analysis attributes the Federal Reserve's failures in the 1930s to institutional dysfunction, internal disagreements, and adherence to the gold standard that limited its available tools, rather than to deliberate inducement of the Depression for the benefit of banking interests. The 2008 financial crisis provides a more recent test case. The crisis was the product of a complex accumulation of factors, including the securitization of mortgage-backed securities with inadequate risk assessment, the regulatory failures that permitted the accumulation of leverage that made the financial system fragile, the specific incentive structures that rewarded short-term profit at the expense of long-term stability, and the interaction between these factors in ways that produced a cascade of failures that the people managing the system did not anticipate and did not want. The people who did anticipate it and who positioned their investments accordingly, the investors who shorted mortgage-backed securities before the crisis, made large profits. Their foresight and their profit-taking are sometimes cited as evidence of prior knowledge of a scheduled event, rather than as evidence of superior analysis of publicly available information about the quality of the underlying mortgages. The financial system is genuinely complex in ways that make its operations opaque to most people who are affected by it. The decisions made in central banks and financial institutions do affect the distribution of wealth and economic risk in ways that systematically benefit some participants over others. The people who make these decisions are not elected and are not fully accountable to democratic processes. The financial sector does have significant influence over the regulatory frameworks that govern it. These are real features of how the system operates, and they are the appropriate subjects of democratic scrutiny, academic research, and policy reform. The claim that economic crises are scheduled events, however, requires a level of coordination and predictability in a system whose complexity is the reason it is difficult to govern effectively. The financial system that can be deliberately crashed and predictably recovered by the same actors who crashed it is a financial system whose behavior is more controllable than the documented history of financial crises suggests. The crises have repeatedly surprised the people who are supposed to be most capable of managing them. The surprises are consistent with a system that is complex and poorly understood even by its operators. They are not consistent with a system whose operations are being directed by architects who understand it well enough to schedule its crises. The architects are real. They are quieter than most people imagine, and more confused.
Chapter 23. The Religion Underneath the Religion. There is an eye above a pyramid on the back of the American dollar bill. It has been there since 1935, when the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States was first printed on currency. The eye is called the Eye of Providence, and it appears above an unfinished pyramid with the date 1776 in Roman numerals at its base. The phrase annuit coeptis appears above it, a Latin phrase meaning roughly, "He has favored our undertakings," with the "he" understood to refer to God. The phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum appears below the pyramid, meaning New Order of the Ages. The imagery was designed by a committee working on the seal in the early years of the Republic and was influenced by the Enlightenment iconography of the period, in which the eye was a common symbol of divine watchfulness. The question of why this imagery is on the dollar bill, and what it means that it is there, has occupied the attention of conspiracy theorists for decades in ways that have produced a body of interpretation that is as elaborate as it is difficult to falsify. The pyramid without a capstone represents a plan not yet completed. The eye represents the hidden masters who are guiding the completion of the plan. The Novus Ordo Seclorum is the explicit announcement of the New World Order, whose construction is the project of those hidden masters. The date 1776 is not the founding of the United States, but the founding of the Illuminati, which occurred in Bavaria in that same year. The dollar bill is a message from the architects of a hidden project, displayed in the most widely circulated artifact in American life, legible only to those who know how to read it.
The Freemasons are central to most versions of this interpretation, and the Masonic connection to the founding generation of the United States is documented rather than invented.
Many of the prominent figures of the American Revolution and the early Republic were Freemasons, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, and a substantial number of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The Masonic symbolism of the period, including the all-seeing eye and the use of classical and geometric imagery, was widely employed in public and private contexts by people who belonged to the fraternal organization, and who found in its ritual and symbolism a framework for expressing Enlightenment values of reason and brotherhood. The influence of Masonic aesthetics on the visual language of the early American Republic is genuine. Freemasonry is a fraternal organization with a documented history that begins in the 17th century in England and Scotland, building on the traditions of the medieval stonemason guilds in ways that were partly symbolic and partly practical. It has a ritual structure that involves degrees of initiation, secret handshakes and signs and words, and ceremonial practices that vary between its different branches and jurisdictions. It has been the subject of suspicion, persecution, and prohibition by governments and religious institutions across its history, including a formal papal condemnation that has been maintained in various forms since 1738. The Catholic Church's objection to Freemasonry has historically centered on concerns about its secret nature, its requirement that members take oaths, and its claimed universalism, which the Church has interpreted as indifferent to or in competition with Catholic identity. The ritual elements of Freemasonry, the initiation ceremonies, the symbolic deaths and rebirths, the allegorical drama that forms part of the higher degrees, draw on a range of religious and philosophical traditions that include Egyptian mythology, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, and classical philosophy. The synthesis is deliberate and is not hidden from Masonic members, who are introduced to the symbolic system through the degree structure. The claim that this synthesis represents the worship of a hidden deity, that the god named in Masonic ritual is distinct from and opposed to the god of Christian or Jewish or Islamic tradition, is a claim that has been made by critics of Freemasonry since the 18th century, and that the organization's own members and scholars have consistently disputed. Albert Pike, a 19th century American Freemason who wrote an encyclopedic text on the symbolism of the Scottish Rite called Morals and Dogma, is the figure most frequently cited in support of the hidden worship claim. A passage from his book, which is frequently quoted out of context in anti-Masonic literature and in conspiracy theory accounts of Freemasonry, appears to identify the deity worshipped by Freemasons as Lucifer. The passage, read in its full context, is part of an allegory about the nature of light and knowledge, in which Lucifer is used in its etymological sense as light-bearer, the Latin translation of the Hebrew word for the morning star, rather than in its theological sense as the name of the devil. The distinction is significant and is the subject of genuine scholarly disagreement about what Pike intended. But the version in which Pike explicitly endorsed the worship of Satan as the hidden religion of Freemasonry is not supported by the full text of his work. The Skull and Bones Society at Yale University is a documented secret society that has been a pathway to elite networks for a significant portion of its members. Its initiation rituals are secret, and members take oaths of confidentiality about their content. Former members include several American presidents, senior government officials, intelligence officers, and prominent figures in business and law. The society's influence on the networks that connect the American elite is real, in the sense that membership has functioned as a credential within certain circles, and has facilitated the formation of relationships that have sometimes had significant professional and political consequences. Whether the society's rituals involve the worship of anything beyond the theatrical, and the theatrical invocation of death imagery that has characterized Western fraternal organizations generally, is something that the available evidence from former members does not support in any specific form. The persistence of the religion underneath the religion theory reflects something real about the relationship between ritual, power, and secrecy that runs through human institutional life. The institutions that have concentrated the most power across history have consistently employed ritual elements that mark membership, create bonds of loyalty, and distinguish insiders from outsiders. The Catholic Church, the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, had its own ritual structure, with its own degrees of initiation and its own reserved knowledge. The political parties, the professional guilds,
the military organizations, and the fraternal orders all employ versions of the same structure.
The ritual is a technology of group cohesion, and the secrecy is a technology of boundary maintenance. What is worshipped in the ritual is not always what the ritual claims to worship, and is not always what the critics claim is worshipped. It is more often the group itself, the solidarity, the sense of belonging to something that matters, the specific quality of being among people who have undergone the same ceremony and who share the same symbols. The religion underneath the religion is sometimes simply the religion of belonging. The eye on the pyramid is watching, but what it is watching for is not what the theory needs it to be. Chapter 24. The algorithm that knows before you do. There is a story that circulates in the technology world that has the quality of an urban legend, but that has enough documented basis to be taken seriously as a description of a real capability rather than a fantasy about one. A major retail chain was using purchasing data to identify customers who were pregnant on the basis of specific patterns of product purchases that correlated with pregnancy in their customer database, and to market pregnancy-related products to those customers before they had publicly disclosed their pregnancies. The story became widely known when a version of it appeared in a New York Times article in 2012, in which a father was reported to have complained to a Target store about the pregnancy-related marketing materials his teenage daughter had received, only to learn that his daughter was indeed pregnant and had not yet told him. The data knew before the father did. The story is probably at least partially constructed in the telling, as these kinds of illustrative anecdotes tend to be, but the underlying capability it describes is real, and was real at the time of the article, and has become significantly more sophisticated in the years since. The pattern recognition that can identify pregnancy from purchasing data is a specific application of a general capability for inferring private states and intentions from behavioral data. The capability extends across a wide range of private states, emotional states, health conditions, sexual orientation, political beliefs, religious affiliation, financial vulnerability. The data that is collected in the ordinary course of digital life, the searches, the purchases, the locations, the social connections, the content of communications, assembles into a profile whose inferences can exceed what the person being profiled knows about themselves or would choose to disclose. The legal framework governing this collection and use varies significantly across jurisdictions and has not kept pace with the pace of the technological capability. In the United States, the legal framework is largely sectoral, meaning that specific categories of data are governed by specific regulations, but there is no comprehensive data protection law of the kind that the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation attempts to provide. The result is a system in which the collection and use of personal data is constrained in some specific contexts and largely unconstrained in others, and in which the people whose data is being collected have limited visibility into what is collected, how it is used, and who has access to it. The documented history of government access to commercial data collections adds a dimension to the corporate surveillance picture that changes its implications. The PRISM program, revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013, was a program through which the National Security Agency obtained data from major American technology companies, including Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and others. The program operated under legal authorities provided by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and was disclosed to congressional committees in a classified context, but was not publicly known until the Snowden documents were published by The Guardian and The Washington Post. The companies whose data was accessed disputed some of the characterizations of the program's operation, but the basic fact of government access to their data through court-ordered processes was confirmed. The Snowden revelations produced several documented facts that had previously been either denied or unknown. The NSA was collecting metadata on essentially all telephone communications within the United States, not targeted at specific individuals, but comprehensive. The program operated under a legal interpretation of the Patriot Act that was classified and that had been rejected by a secret court before being accepted by a different composition of that court. The oversight of the program by the congressional committees that were supposed to provide accountability was limited by the classification of the legal interpretations under which it operated. The Director of National Intelligence made a public statement denying the existence of this kind of bulk collection that was, by the standard of ordinary English, False. The predictive technology that is now being applied in law enforcement contexts adds another dimension. Predictive policing systems use historical crime data to identify areas and individuals at elevated risk of criminal activity and to direct police resources accordingly. These systems have been adopted by police departments in multiple American cities and have been the subject of significant criticism from civil liberties organizations and academic researchers who have documented ways in which they reproduce and amplify the biases present in the historical data they use. Arrest data, which is the most commonly used input to these systems, reflects both actual criminal activity and the patterns of police deployment and enforcement, and when these are used to predict future enforcement, the system tends to direct resources to the same communities that were previously over-policed, which produces more arrests in those communities, which reinforces the prediction, in a feedback loop that the system's proponents have not adequately addressed. The facial recognition technology that has been deployed by law enforcement agencies in the United States and internationally has a documented accuracy problem that falls disproportionately on people with darker skin. The error rates for facial recognition systems across demographic groups have been studied by researchers at MIT and NIST and have consistently found that the systems are least accurate for Black women, with error rates in some systems that are dramatically higher than for white men. The systems have been used in law enforcement contexts in ways that have produced wrongful identification and, in at least several documented cases, wrongful arrest of individuals who were misidentified by the technology, and his subsequent encounters with the legal system were traumatic, even when they did not result in conviction. The question of when data collection stops being a service and becomes something closer to ownership is the central question of the current technological moment, and it does not have a settled answer in either law or ethics. The argument that the data is provided voluntarily in exchange for free services, which is the framework that most of the major technology companies operate under, becomes less persuasive as the data collection becomes more comprehensive and as the uses to which it is put become more consequential. The person who accepted the terms of service for a social media platform may have consented to their public posts being used for advertising targeting. Whether they consented to their browsing history being used to infer their mental health status, or their location data being sold to data brokers who sell it to law enforcement, or their message content being used to train AI systems, requires a definition of consent that the length and opacity of the terms of service documents does not provide. The algorithm that knows before you do is not a conspiracy. It is a service you agreed to, in terms you did not read, for reasons you did not fully understand, with consequences that are still being discovered, by people whose job it is to find uses for what you gave them, when you thought you were just getting something for free. Chapter 25. The conspiracy that was just reality. There is a posture that this series has been building toward without announcing itself as building toward it. Not the posture of the person who believes everything. Not the posture of the person who dismisses everything. Something harder to maintain and more honest than either, which is the posture of the person who has looked at enough of the documented record to know that the dismissal is not always warranted, and who has also looked at enough of the conspiratorial literature to know that the belief is not always warranted, and who has developed some capacity to sit in the uncomfortable space between these two recognitions without resolving the discomfort by choosing one of the easy exits. The easy exits are both available and both tempting. The first says that institutions are fundamentally corrupt, and their official accounts are fundamentally unreliable, and the appropriate default relationship to any institutional claim is suspicion that requires substantial evidence to overcome. The second says that the scientific and governmental and journalistic institutions of modern democratic societies, whatever their flaws, represent the best available mechanisms for producing reliable accounts of reality, and that the appropriate default relationship to their consensus positions is acceptance that requires substantial evidence to revise. Both positions have arguments in their favor. Both are too simple for the world that the documented record reveals. The documented record reveals both things simultaneously. It reveals Operation Northwoods and MK and the Tuskegee study and COINTELPRO and the Gulf of Tonkin and the tobacco industry's concealment of its own research and the pharmaceutical industry's influence on the regulatory frameworks that govern it. These are real. They demonstrate that institutions of significant power are capable of deliberate deception, non-consensual experimentation on human beings, coordinated suppression of information,
and the engineering of consent in ways that serve institutional interests at the expense of the public interest. The person who takes these cases seriously and adjusts their prior probability for institutional malfeasance accordingly is responding rationally to documented evidence. The documented record also reveals the moon landing, and the spherical Earth, and the germ theory of disease, and the causal mechanism of climate change, and the absence of the population-controlling fluoride mind control water additives, and the absence of the secret network of underground bases housing the children of elites during the coming catastrophe. The consensus of the relevant scientific communities on these questions is not the product of a coordinated conspiracy. It is the product of the ordinary processes of scientific investigation, which are slow and imperfect and subject to various forms of bias and institutional pressure, and which have nevertheless produced the most reliable method of acquiring knowledge about the physical world that human beings have developed. The person who extends the warranted suspicion of institutional malfeasance into an unwarranted rejection of scientific consensus is not responding rationally to documented evidence. They are applying a pattern that fits some cases to all cases, which is the error that this series has been describing from multiple angles. The question of how to distinguish the cases where the suspicion is warranted from the cases where it is not is the question that this final chapter is organized around, and the answer is not a simple algorithm. It is a set of habits and orientations that improve the discrimination over time. The first is the distinction between anomaly and evidence. The anomaly is the thing that does not fit the official account. The evidence is the thing that supports an alternative account. These are not the same thing. The anomaly in the official account of an event is real data that requires explanation. It may be explained by the alternative account the theorist proposes. It may be explained by the limitations of the official investigation. It may be explained by the ordinary complexity of events that official accounts necessarily simplify. The anomaly is where the questioning starts, not where it ends. Treating the anomaly as sufficient to establish the alternative account, without the evidence that would positively support the alternative, is the move that most conspiracy theories make and that the Holmesian standard of investigation does not permit. The second is the test of falsifiability. The theory that cannot be falsified in principle is not providing a model of reality that can be tested. A theory that is confirmed by both the presence of evidence and the absence of evidence, that treats both the document that proves it and the missing document that would have proved it as equally supportive, is not a theory in the scientific sense. It is an interpretation framework that will find support in whatever exists because it has been designed to do so. The useful question is not what would confirm this theory, but what would falsify it. If the answer is nothing, the theory is not making a claim about reality that can be distinguished from other claims. The third is the requirement of scale proportionality. The scale of the coordination required by a proposed conspiracy should be proportional to the scale of the documented coordination that human institutions have actually achieved. The Tuskegee study required the knowing participation of a limited number of public health service researchers and medical personnel over 40 years, and it was eventually exposed by a whistleblower. MKUltra required the coordination of a CIA program with contractors and researchers, and was eventually partially exposed through documents that survived a records destruction order. These are real achievements of institutional concealment, and they have upper bounds on their scale and duration. The theory that requires the coordinated silence of hundreds of thousands of people across decades and national boundaries is asking for something that the documented history of actual institutional concealment does not support. The fourth is the question of who benefits from the conspiracy theory itself. The theory that the vaccine causes autism, which has been thoroughly investigated and thoroughly refuted, caused substantial preventable harm to children whose parents declined vaccination on the basis of the theory. The harm was not to the pharmaceutical companies whose products were being refused. The harm was to the children. The theory was promoted by people with various motivations, including genuine but mistaken belief, financial interest in alternative medicine, and the specific grief of parents whose children had received autism diagnoses, and who found in the theory an explanation that pointed outward, rather than toward the randomness and complexity of neurodevelopmental conditions. The theory's promotion was not in the interest of the people it was supposed to be protecting. The fifth, and perhaps the most important, is the willingness to update. The person who has concluded that a particular conspiracy theory is correct, and who then refuses to update in response to new evidence, is not engaged in the kind of inquiry that produces accurate beliefs. The willingness to hold a theory provisionally, to acknowledge that the evidence may shift, to say this is my best current assessment on the basis of the available evidence, and I am prepared to revise it, is the mark of the person who is actually trying to understand reality rather than defending a conclusion they reached before the investigation was complete. The conspiracy that was just reality is the most important category in this entire series. It is the category that contains the Tuskegee study and MKUltra and Operation Northwoods and COINTELPRO. The genuine conspiracies that were dismissed as paranoid fantasy until the documents arrived. This category is not empty. It is why the suspicion is not irrational. It is why the questions should be asked. It is why the default dismissal of all conspiratorial claims is not adequate to the documented history of what institutions have done and what they have concealed. But the category is also not unlimited. It does not extend to everything. The line between the category and the claims that exceed it is drawn by evidence, by the test of falsifiability, by the requirement of plausible mechanism, by the willingness to update in response to contrary evidence. The line is not always easy to find. Finding it requires work. The work is the ongoing practice of asking the right questions rather than settling into the comfort of either the dismissal or the belief. Ask whether the questioned. Ask what evidence would change the answer. Ask whether the scale of the claim matches the scale of what institutions have actually managed. Ask who benefits from the claim being believed. Ask whether you are willing to be wrong, and then look, carefully, at what is actually there.